And for the ex-cappers that are here, I wanted to make sure you guys saw the informational attachment that we have, which is basically the draft of chapter 4 that Megan had turned in prior to her leaving. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but she did a great job, and we're thankful to have that. Okay, we do have a quorum. And so if someone could call the roll, that would be great.
Sure, I'll do that. Okie doke. Gregory Braille.
I'm here.
Phil Burton.
Here.
Tony Carrasco.
Not here.
Okay. In Yang Cho.
Not here.
Larry Klein.
Here.
Nadia Nayak.
Here.
Keith Reckdahl.
Not here, but he will be a few minutes late, he said.
Dave Shen.
Here.
Carrie Templeton.
Here.
That's it.
Great. Okay, awesome. So we'll start off with oral communications. I see 2 hands up. Again, as a reminder, if there's anybody in the public who wants to comment on something not on the agenda, you should please raise your hand. And each speaker will have 2 minutes. And so we have helping us today, we have Jose and Chirag who are helping me do public comment today between doing the slides and the timer. So a big thank you to the Office of Transportation for helping us with the magic.
Right.
Take it away.
We have 2 speakers. First, we have Catherine Jordan, and followed by David Kennedy. Catherine, it's your turn to speak. Please unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the XCAP for this opportunity to speak, and thank you for all your hard work on this project. Prior to COVID, Caltrain's business plan had optimistic projections, which did not match up with its ridership demands, the demand for its ridership. In 2 of the 3 prior years to COVID, it had slight declines in ridership, which has been flat since 2016. Post-COVID, Caltrain has admitted that its business plan is no longer valid or operable. That business plan is paused as we speak. The reason stated for grade separations in a memo to the XCAP from the chair was increased number of trains. However, that increased service from Caltrain, increased number of trains, is no longer valid. There is no longer a reason that a number of trains will be increased, and it does not look likely in the near future that it will be. Currently, there's no ridership, 95% down. There's no money. We've seen that Caltrain's agencies that fund it are busy scrapping over its potential money that it might get from a sales tax revenues. The city has no money currently to help fund grade separations. No business tax. Currently, there's no prospect of a need for them since there's no need for an increased number of trains. It seems premature for the XCAP, after all of its hard work, to be making recommendations based on an outdated business plan that is no longer operable or viable, with projections that are no longer valid. So please consider that as you have a schedule that you are trying to meet, and take into consideration that the world has changed for many reasons as you go about your business. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And we're working on getting that timer up. Sorry about that. I'll give staff 1 minute, see if they can figure that out. But Kathy, you did a good job self-timing.
All right. Next, we have David Kennedy. It's your turn to speak. Please unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Good afternoon. I too would like to acknowledge the hard work of the XCAP and acknowledge also that you probably know more about railroad crossings than any other group in Palo Alto. I became interested and started paying attention after this process was well underway and missed city council imposed criteria and early considerations and discussions. That being said, it strikes me that most of the options still being considered are being forced to fit with many compromises. Traffic pattern standpoint. It appears that all the below grade crossings will be constrained and claustrophobic and will be challenging to navigate. I know you're trying to produce a report on a schedule, but I encourage you to take advantage of the COVID-19 delays. I still think we need grade separations, but there's an opportunity here. And I think the opportunity is to be visionary. By improving the traffic patterns, opening up the structures to enhance the travel experience for all peds, bikes, vehicles. This will require some additional, but probably modest property acquisitions at each crossing. It'll also require more time and more work by AECom, but I think there's time here with the delays that Caltrain will be facing. However, on your updated understandings of the XCAP, you could propose revised criteria to the council to moderate or remove many of the constraints that are imposed at the beginning of this process. This would allow consideration of options previously eliminated. So I thank you, and I'm sure future generations will thank you to end up with crossings that better represent the city of Palo Alto. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's it for public comment. Great. So we will move to item number 3, which is a review of the Hexagon final traffic report with Gary Black. Thanks, Gary, for coming.
There, I unmuted myself. So I want to talk about how this report is different than the last one that you saw. And I think the primary difference is that we added an analysis of some tweaks to what we call the partial underpass alternative for Meadow and Charleston. So I think it was Keith, hopefully I'm giving credit to the right person, who had the idea to allow U-turns at the, I think it's called Alma Station Shopping Center, where there's a signal there. And if U-turns were allowed, then that would accommodate an additional 2 movements that otherwise would not be possible at the Meadow Meadow interchange. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? Or maybe it's best to put the design up. What do you think?
If you have a picture, it's always easier for us to talk to a picture, because I think
Let me try the share screen here.
that'd be great.
It says we'll stop other screen sharing. Yes. So here's the picture. So can you see the picture now?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the drawing that Peter came up with, AECom. And so I don't know if you can see the little cursor, but so with this on-ramp going north, well, not this on-ramp for it, that wouldn't work. But if you're going north on Alma, you can get over here into this left turn lane and then make a U-turn, come down this ramp, and then you can turn left or right. So that provides 2 additional connections that weren't otherwise available. The other thing we've done is that there's a lot of discussion about how to allow left turns that go like this. So they're going eastbound and they make a left turn to go north on this connecting ramp. The original design going back a ways didn't even allow that movement, but the XCAP said we really want to allow that movement. So let's figure out a way to do it. I think initially we said that that in order to allow that movement, you would need a left turn pocket on Meadow. And our basis for saying that was looking up, there's some documents in traffic engineering world that sort of give indications of when things are needed or not needed. And we looked at one of the standard reference works that says, given volume on Meadow, you really should have a left turn pocket there. But then when Peter actually drew a design to accommodate that left turn pocket, it really blows up this entire interchange design, which I think you've seen. If you have questions about it, I think Peter can show what he drew, but fitting that left turn lane in there creates all kinds of other issues. So Peter came back to me and said, geez, do we really, really need to have that? Or can we get this to work without it? So we went back, and instead of just looking at standard reference works, we actually ran a simulation of this interchange without the left turn pocket. We ran it 3 different ways. One with just allowing left turns, what we call uncontrolled. So there's no control at this intersection. The left turns just turn when there's a gap. We also looked at stop signs at this intersection. We looked at a signal at this intersection. It doesn't make any difference which one you implement. The left turns would work under any of those scenarios. So now we have design that allows left turns from eastbound Meadow to northbound Alma. So that's an additional turn movement that can be accommodated. So when all is said and done, there's now with this design, there's only 2 movements that are not possible. And that is coming westbound to southbound, that's not possible. And coming eastbound to southbound. Those 2 are not possible, but the other 6 movements are possible. We ran the simulation of this to get the results, and those are in the report. And basically everything works fine. The U-turn works fine. So that the intersection up here works okay. This intersection works okay. This intersection works okay. And it actually improves a little bit the delay and function down at Charleston, because some of the movements that would otherwise take place at Charleston, because they got kind of displaced down there, they wouldn't need to take place at Charleston. They could actually stay here at Meadow. So that reduces the turning volume a little bit down at Charleston. So there's a little bit of an improvement there. So that's what's different in this version of the traffic report compared to the last one you saw. So I can go into a lot more detail if you want. Otherwise, we'll just see if anybody has any questions about this.
Gary, this is Millette. Are you also going to mention the number of trains? I believe you increased that too, yes?
Yeah, that was a minor, I mean, yeah, we were
Correct.
asked to study 14 trains in 2030 instead of 12, but that didn't really make much difference. You'd have a hard time seeing any difference between the results based on that number of trains.
Did it have the most difference for if we do no improvements, I'm assuming? That's probably where it hit the numbers the worst.
Yeah, because it's not a linear relationship between delay and the amount of time the gate is down. So if the intersection is bad to start with, then yeah, when you increase the number of trains, it gets proportionally worse.
Okay. Ex-cappers, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. I see Phil's already got his hand up. And if the rest of you have questions, if you could virtually raise your hand for me, that way I can keep tabs. That'd be easier. Thanks, Dave. Okay, Phil, you're first.
Okay, Gary, thank you very much. Concerning the U-turn around at Alma Station,
Alma Plaza.
Alma Plaza rather, sorry. Are there any restrictions on the kind of vehicles that can be safely accommodated?
Well, the radius of this U-turn is such that it could be made by basically cars, but large trucks would not be able to make the U-turn. However, I should point out the large trucks cannot make U-turns at most intersections, even though U-turns U-turns are typically allowed when there's 48 feet of diameter from here to here. If that's 48 feet, then U-turns are allowed. However, trucks cannot make a turn in 48 feet. So this would be not an unusual situation.
What about fire trucks or other emergency vehicles?
Yeah, Gary, I could chime in on that. Yeah, Phil, we looked at the turning movement for what we're using as the design vehicle, the WB40, which is like a 40-foot long bus or simulates a fire truck, and that cannot make this turn here. The constraint here is the Caltrain right of way. So to stay outside the right of way, the radius had to be pretty tight.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dave, Shen.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, for doing this. Great stuff. A couple questions. On page 2, you talk about Churchill closure operating at a level service C. Is that just referring to the turning movements that remain after closing one side of Churchill? Is that what that means?
Let me get to, I don't know what you're seeing on the screen now. Sorry about that.
Scrolling. Page 2, please. Yeah.
Can you see the scrolling?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's kind of cool. We'll experience this together then.
It's very dizzying. Yeah.
One more page. So, so where are you referring to on this page?
Probably towards. Oh, actually, you know what? I might have made it wrong. Can you go to the next page, please? It's definitely on the table here.
Okay.
So on table 1, you see Churchill closure AM PM is C, level service C and C. And I was curious about, was that just simply referring to the turning movements that were that were left? That's the C rating that we see there, or what does that C mean?
Yeah, that's the turning movements that are left. That's correct.
Okay. And then on the partial underpass, you have B for AM. And I was wondering what causes the B here, because it seems like it's just a mirror image of the Churchill closure one where the opening is on the other side. So I was just curious how that resulted in a B versus the C of the closure.
That's that B is okay. So I see what you're saying. It's mirroring the other side, but
I mean,
I think the reason is that with the closure, you're going to have volumes. You're going to have northbound and southbound ALMA controlled by the signal. But with the partial underpass, you only have southbound ALMA controlled by the signal. Northbound is not controlled. So that would be why with the partial underpass, you get a better level of service at the signal because it doesn't have as many turning movements that are being controlled.
Okay. All right. Staying on this table for a second, why is the viaduct so much worse than either of those two?
Well, the viaduct leaves just tracks the train over everything. So it leaves all of the turning movements occurring there. And so it's a lot more turning movements that are controlled by the signal under the viaduct alternative than either the closure or the partial underpass, because the closure and the partial underpass, those are basically T intersections under those two scenarios. Versus under the viaduct, it's a regular 4-way intersection, allows all 12 movements to occur. And because of that, there's just more traffic to accommodate. And so it's a poor level of service.
Okay. And just an overall question. This talks about just the intersection at Churchill, and we're still trying to kind of bind in the fact that the closure has mitigations associated with it. And I'm wondering why we're choosing to just focus on the intersection and not the whole project as the whole thing as a project.
Well, there is another report that we did that looked at the all of the intersections around there, and it's actually an appendix to this. And that was reviewed by the XCAP, gosh, at this point, I think it's been months ago. Looking at what happens when you close Churchill and where the detour traffic goes to, and then what happens, on those detour routes, the level of service and so forth. So that's all analyzed in a separate report. Under the partial underpass scenario, there's only a couple of movements that would be detoured with that. And we did not do an analysis of what would happen with that in terms of the resulting levels of service, but the number of detoured cars is so low. I would say detoured, it's not really the right word, but reassigned, we use that word, reassigned, that it's not going to really make any noticeable difference.
Okay.
I don't think.
All right. Further down on page 14, table 3 and 4, if you could go down there. I think that's Meadow and Charleston's data.
I could probably do this faster, couldn't I? Okay, here's
click
3.
on the right. Okay, there you go. So I was wondering why the viaduct here was much worse than the underpass.
Well, it's the same
Talk
story.
about that a little bit.
Is that with the viaduct, the train goes over the top, but all of the other movements are still there. So all of the turning movements that happen at those two intersections at Alma and Meadow and Alma and Charleston are occurring just like they do today. The only difference is that the train interruption goes away. And under the partial underpass alternative, a lot of those movements are gone. They're going somewhere else. And so these signals are much simpler. Under the viaduct, those are regular 4-way intersections. Under the partial underpass, those are T intersections with ramps that only allow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movements at one of them and only 4 movements at the other one. So instead of 12 movements, you have a much smaller number of traffic movements that are being made at those signals.
Yeah, and I guess also there's north and southbound on Charleston Road, just goes straight through Alma, for example, I guess. Whereas on the viaduct, it wouldn't be, it was stopped by a light.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. That's why I said those movements are removed from the signal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just last, just a clarification on, I guess it's shown in figures 9B, 9C, and 9E. It just seemed like there's a ton of traffic from Meadow that's getting routed to Charleston because of the missing turning movements. Is that?
Well, that's without Keith's idea. So those are without the U-turn and without the allowing a left turn from eastbound Meadow to northbound Alma.
Oh, okay.
So those are, yeah. So it's not with.
So
with
like all
Keith,
these.
I'll call it Keith's plan for lack of a better word. A lot of these would not be diverted. Some of them would, but not as many.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave. Any other ex-cappers who have a comment or a question about the traffic report? Greg?
Hi. So yeah, I am concerned about the added traffic movements through the ones we're looking right now, but especially the very next page, 9B and also 9D, where basically we're creating what people in neighborhoods like to call cut-through traffic, but we're basically having people follow their Google Maps through your neighborhood who never would have done that before. And I imagine that the reason why we haven't heard about this from the public is that not a lot of people have seen these charts yet. And I feel that we will. Do any of the changes we're proposing, in fact, Keith's plan, it would be nice to be really specific on what changes those. And then the second question is, we have talked about possibly something like the hybrid option on Meadow and the partial underpass option on Charleston or vice versa. Do any of those help alleviate the situation?
Well, yes, they would. And you can you can sort of answer these questions for yourself by looking at these figures. But if you look at 9B, which we're looking at right now, under the partial underpass alternative, that movement that shows 80 cars would not be possible. And so this is Gary's idea of where these cars would go instead. You can ask yourself whether you think Gary is correct or whether you think that they would follow some other detour instead of what I drew here.
Right.
So, you can use your judgment about whether you think they might, just go on Middlefield down to Charleston, not go on any local streets.
Yeah, but definitely this is like, this would be a logical way to go. If you can't make the turn, you could make the four. So I really hope that we can, if we're going to add additional turning movements, that we could get an updated version of this that takes those into consideration, because I think, these are very, very lightly traveled residential streets. In fact, I think this one on South Court might even be a bike route. Oh no, it's 1 block away from the bike route. Well, it'll change because we're changing where the bikes go. So, that seems like a lot of cars through a place that doesn't normally get it. So thanks.
And you asked about if there was a combination of, say, the partial underpass and a viaduct. Well, if you had a viaduct at
well, no, not a viaduct. We can't do that. Sorry. But
hybrid. You said hybrid, right?
Hybrid. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you did the hybrid here, then this movement could still happen right here.
Right.
So there would be no traffic that would be.
So then this chart goes away. Yeah.
This chart goes away.
Yeah.
Then this one, I don't know if you asked about this one, but this one with Keith's change, this would be accommodated on the partial underpass, so there would be no detour. Let's go up to this one. This movement would be accommodated with the U-turn, so this would not be detoured on 9A. That would not be detoured.
9A, that's the one we're looking at. Yeah.
And
what about 9D? Did we look at 9D? Yeah. No.
So 9D, this would be accommodated by the U-turn, so this would not be detoured.
Yeah.
This would not be accommodated, so this one would be detoured.
Yeah.
Then we get into those. So the only one that I guess you can say is going to be a concern is this one, 9B.
Yeah.
This movement would not be allowed. There's 80 cars that make that movement during the peak hour.
Yeah.
So that's the, I guess, universe of cars that are going to be seeking an alternative route.
Right.
Wait, couldn't they? I thought you said, Gary, that they could instead make a right and then U-turn, correct?
No, they can't.
At Meadow, there's a dedicated right turn.
Yeah, but that movement is not possible because it's too close. Let's go to the drawing. Okay, here's the drawing.
Yeah.
So if you come up this ramp, you're not going to be, with this design, you would not be allowed to shoot across into this turn lane here.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then make a turn. That would be an unsafe maneuver because this ramp doesn't really join up until right about here.
Okay.
Then it would be unsafe to shoot across 3 lanes to get into a pocket. So with this design, there would need to be some sort of physical barrier here, right along here, that would stop any cars from doing that.
Okay, so 9B and 9E are the ones not able to be fixed by Keith's.
9B for sure. Let me look at 9E here. Correct. Those are the two. Yeah.
Okay.
But doesn't 9B, if we were to put a hybrid at Meadow and a partial underpass at Charleston, wouldn't that fix 9B, or am I not keep remembering all the details of
you're
the
right.
hybrid?
You're right. If you had a hybrid at Meadow and the partial underpass at Charleston, then you would not get that. You would not have this detour of 9B. That would not happen.
Okay.
Those cars could still use Meadow like they do now.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Any other ex-cappers have something?
I guess just to recap, I know there's so many permutations here that your mind starts to spin. So an easy way to think of it is with this partial underpass alternative, all the movements are allowed at Charleston, so nothing gets detoured. 6 out of the 8 movements are allowed at Meadow. So there's two movements that would not be accommodated. So they would have to go someplace else. Kind of maybe a simple way to think about it.
Tony, I see your hand up.
Yes, my questions are related mainly to are bikes considered in these numbers? For instance, at Meadow and Charleston, there are several bikes who use it in the mornings and the evenings from schools. And I'm wondering if those numbers have been integrated into these calculations. And my follow-up question is, do we refer to the graphics and plans that AECOM have presented in order to find out where the bikes and peds go? So 2 questions.
The first question about have bikes been incorporated, the bikes have been incorporated into the calculations of the operations of the intersections. In terms of where bikes would go under the different design alternatives, I'd have to turn it over to Peter to explain that. Let's do this one. Can we walk through this diagram, Tony? Would that answer your question?
Tony, we lost you. Would that answer your question if Gary goes through this diagram?
Well, I would have Peter go through this diagram because he knows it a lot better than I do.
Oh, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone over this already. Is there any specific movement you want to know how bikes get from point A to B? I don't want to go through all of these options. It'll take me quite a while to do.
But
Peter,
these are see what I'm showing, what I'm looking at now, Peter?
Yeah.
These are little bike crossovers, right? There's one here.
Yeah, it's a ped bridge.
And there's one here.
Yep.
Tony,
So
did you have something specific?
No, I didn't, Peter, thanks. So we refer to the graphics to look at where they go.
So the bikes go across here and across here. And if they're going if they're going just along Meadow, they're in this bike channel here, 2-way bike channel.
Yes.
Along here.
Got it.
Anything else, Tony?
No,
Okay.
I'm good.
Anybody else from XCAP? If so, raise your hand. By the way, I see that In Young has joined the meeting, just for the record. I don't know when she came in because I can't quite see everybody at the same time, but hi, In Young. All right, now I have a list of questions that I'd like to go through. So Gary, can you explain, Dave was talking about why do those intersections under the viaducts do so much worse? Do these numbers account for the inducement that's going to happen now that train preemption goes away in the future numbers that you have?
No, they don't.
Okay, so actually those will probably get worse, right?
Well, there's a limit to how many cars can be served in an hour. And so they can't really get any worse, frankly.
But what I'm saying is that this is estimating the numbers, but is not estimating that now that there's no train preemption, more people might go through these intersections, right? The more efficient they are, the more likely they are to induce people or cars to drive through there. Yes?
Yes, in theory, but the 2030 forecasts for these interchanges or these crossings are so high to start with that I don't think that they could really get any higher. And in fact, they really don't even account. It's more like the other way around.
How is that? Because with train preemption, I mean, in the future, with no improvements of train preemption, they're going to do terrible because the train also keeps interrupting things. Presumably,
you're talking about volume though. So the 2030 volume that's being used in these analyses, they're not constrained by train crossing, by gate downtime. So if I'm explaining that correctly, so the 2030 volumes do not assume any constraints of the gates being down.
Okay.
So these 2030 volumes are kind of like, these are the volumes that you're going to get without any constraints on the gate downtime. If the gate comes down enough, the 2030 volume would actually be less than this. I mean, some of these.
The volume, yes, but the delay would be longer, right?
Well, it would probably equal, what's shown in the tables, because these are theoretical delay numbers. In reality, that there's a limit to how bad they can get, and then they're not going to get any worse than that. So it's kind of like this is a kind of a paper exercise, if you will, for that.
But so my question, I'm thinking specifically about Churchill now. So at Churchill with the partial underpass,
Do you want to show Churchill, or?
Sure, it's 3A is the best picture, I think. Because I have a couple of questions about it.
Oh, the picture.
Yeah, the picture 3A. So with the partial underpass concept, because we have limited turn movements, if you're traveling eastbound on Churchill, you now only have two options, which makes this, if you're someone who wants to go on to northbound Alma, this now makes it a really efficient way to go, because if before I had a choice of going to Embarcadero and then trying to get onto Alma, or going onto Churchill, or even going down to University, this is a much more appealing one, because I know that the light is basically dedicated to me going only north or south on Alma. So wouldn't it induce more cars to go onto Churchill if your desired movement is to get on and off of Alma? And so are there inducement numbers in your projections for the future?
There aren't inducement numbers. Well, let me say this. For the future, well, what if you, we analyzed this with the existing counts, and we analyzed this with the 2030 forecast from the general plan. Those are the two sets of numbers that we used. So for the existing, we just kept it the same as existing, even though you might think that there would be some additional cars that might use this if you didn't get train interruptions. The 2030 assumed that there was no train interruptions. So you wouldn't get higher than the 2030 numbers. You would get, if you were to build this tomorrow, you would probably get numbers that were higher than the existing counts.
Okay.
But not as high as the 2030 forecast.
Right. But I just mean the future numbers using today's projections and no interruptions, but doesn't account for kind of what I'm getting at is the model is not, from my understanding, doesn't work to be able to understand the way drivers think about the road, right? So it's just taking numbers and trying to broadcast forward. It can allow for the train preemption piece, but it can't account for the decisions a driver makes actively, like, oh, it's rush hour, I should avoid this intersection, I'm going to go this other way. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. The model can account for those interruptions, but in this case, as I said, the assumption for existing conditions is that the interruptions are there. The assumption for the future condition is that for the forecasting is that the interruptions are not there.
Okay. So I think you had this in and I apologize, I didn't have time to fully review the appendix again, but I think previously you had like a graphic or a chart that showed like what it takes to get from an intersection rating of a B to a C or a C to a D, which I think would be helpful because it helps you understand the gradations. So when we talk about dumping 80 cars on a particular road, well, does that make me go from a B to an F, or does that just get me from a B to a C? it gets hard to sort of gauge those. Is there a back of the cocktail napkin number that you use, or?
Well, in terms of added volume, no, because there's a lot of things it depends on. It depends how many lanes there are and what, is that a turn, or is that a car turning, or is that a car going straight? And, the signal timing, it's very complicated. And I think we had this discussion before, and I think that there was a list of questions, and that was one of the questions I think that you had.
Okay.
And we prepared an answer sheet to answer those questions. And I can't remember what we said, but let's just throw out an example. So say at the intersection of El Camino and Embarcadero. So to get maybe a level of service change there, you would need to add about, I would say, 400 cars in an hour to
So
get
what
it to
about
change.
streets? Because like Greg, I'm more worried about my neighbors who suddenly got, 150 cars dumped onto their street.
Well, that's not then that's not a level of service, that's public perception, because those, neighborhood streets can physically accommodate a lot of cars, but they're not intended to, and the neighbors don't want them to. So here's another way to think of it. This might help you. Is that typically, most general plans, I can't remember what Palo Alto's general plan says, but most general plans say we like to keep the daily volume on local residential streets, less than 2,000 cars a day. So
yeah,
that's kind of the range for local residential streets. It's usually, between, I don't know what the lower bounds is, maybe 100 cars a day up to 2,000 cars a day. So that's per day. So if you add 100 cars in 1 hour to a local residential street, that's going to be very noticeable. Because that would be, yeah.
So for these smaller streets, 100 is noticeable. Give me the scale there. 100 is noticeable, 50 is meh. I mean, how do you judge those?
Well, I think in order to be, not noticeable at all, just off the top of my head, maybe, less than 10 cars an hour, something like that, would not be noticeable.
Okay.
Noticeable is a sliding scale depending on how many cars are out there already, as you can imagine. If there's a really small number, then you're going to notice an increase.
Right.
So if you're trying to ask me about like that 9B that showed 40 cars onto a local street,
yeah,
I guarantee you people would notice 40 cars on their street in an hour.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then on the traffic volumes for the Churchill partial underpass, I think it's pages 69 and 70 on the PDF, which they're not numbered like that. So this is going to be a fun game of existing.
Do you want me to go to those pages?
Yeah, they're in the append part.
Right. Page, which two?
69 and 70.
Okay.
So
Page
there-
69.
So this is, one is existing volumes, and then with an underpass, the future volumes. How come those numbers don't change very much? There's almost no difference in those numbers.
You mean between this page and this page?
Yeah, the one is supposed to be existing, and then there's in the future, and the numbers don't seem to change at all.
They should change.
Doesn't seem to be, I mean, they're pretty close. There's some change, right? You go from having 189 people going eastbound on Churchill, going northbound on Alma. And then in the future, it's 214. That's why I'm confused about whether, I figured it didn't have inducement from that number, but I couldn't figure out why it's not growing anymore.
Well, these are the 2030 general plan forecasts. I mean, as to why they are what they are, that would take, a lot of research on my part to be able to answer that question.
All right, fair enough. Let me see. You talked about 6 versus 8 movements back at Meadow.
Yeah.
Generally, given the volume of cars and given the 2 turn movements that we can't do, would you consider that pretty good or terrible? Or like for those missing movements, how many cars are, what's the general impact given the throughput?
Well, there's the diagrams show what they are. I think it's 100 and for one of them and 80 for the other.
Yeah, not knowing the relative throughput of the whole intersection, right? I can't tell what percentage of that's a 10% reduction in the total function of the intersection or.
Oh, okay. So at Alma, I'm just going to guess the total volume at peak hour volume at Alma and Meadow is probably 2,500 cars.
Okay.
So you wouldn't be able to accommodate this 90 cars. Or this one, 80 cars. So you'd lose, 170 cars out of your 2,500 cars.
Okay, which from a percent perspective is not terrible.
No.
Okay. Okay. All right, I think that's all the questions I have. I see Phil and Tony also have their hands up. So Phil, you're first and then Tony.
Okay, so I assume I'm first. So Gary, I'm having trouble getting my head around some of these discussions. So forgive me if these questions have been answered. When we think of the city's 2030 volume forecast, you mentioned that it's unconstrained, but since we've had grade crossings since the beginning of time for Palo Alto, how could those forecasts not be constrained implicitly by the existing crossings, even going back 30, 50 years or more?
Well, what I mean by not constrained is that they were not modeled with an increase in the number of trains at the crossing.
Oh, yes, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
But the idea that the city somehow, way back when, I don't know how many years ago, when they did these forecasts, said, we're going to postulate an increase in Caltrain traffic and run forecasts. They didn't do that, obviously. So what?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I wanted to say maybe the word unconstrained is misleading. So we didn't assume an increase in the number of trains.
So can we call that something like a baseline, assuming current rail traffic?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So my next question is, when we think about something like either the viaduct, which has an increase in traffic, or maybe the partial underpass, where do those cars come from, or where do they go? That is, if we look at the net, where are we diverting traffic from, or where are we diverting traffic to?
You mean, why are the 2030 volumes higher than existing?
No, I understand that they're higher because the city, again, assuming the baseline, projected the baseline out to 2030.
Right.
But now if we say in 2030, we're going to have a viaduct, the model seemed to suggest an increase in traffic over the 2030 baseline.
No, it's the same number, whether you have a viaduct or not. We ran it with the same number.
Oh, okay. So we aren't inducing traffic from, let's say, San Antonio Road.
No, we aren't. And, I think that along the lines of Nadia's questioning about the same subject, just based on my experience, just doing stuff like this for a number of years, I don't think that quote unquote induced traffic should really be that much of a consideration for you guys. I mean, it's possible there could be a small amount of induced traffic, but it's not it's not going to be anything substantial.
Are you saying that based on the origins and destinations of traffic?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
So let me rephrase that. Given the traffic on, let's call it the west side of Palo Alto or beyond, in terms of job destinations primarily, that traffic is not that sensitive to a slight change in intersection throughput.
Correct.
Okay, just to clarify that, that's really helpful. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Tony, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, so similar vein of questioning, Gary, it seems to me that this viaduct, under the viaduct, the intersection seems to be attracting more cars to get to a level of service D. Where are they coming from? And if they didn't have that intersection, the 12 turn intersection under the viaduct, where would they go? I think where would they go is sort of outlined in your alternatives for the 40 cars, the slide that you have, which shows sort of where the cars are going. But it seems that the capacity under a viaduct is higher than any of the other alternatives. But more so, I'm just wondering, where do these cars go if they're not performing like the viaduct does?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer your question. The viaduct accommodates all the traffic where it is now. So there's no reason to divert anywhere else because all the movements would be allowed just like they are today. There just wouldn't be any train interruptions. And if you start reducing the number of allowed turning movements at the intersections like you do with these partial underpasses, then the traffic has to go somewhere else if it can't make those turns anymore. But we do assume any traffic that still could stay on Alma, for example, or still could stay on Charleston would stay there. They wouldn't go anywhere else. Does that answer your question or not?
My internet was unstable for half of it, but the first half sounded great.
Okay.
Yeah, my internet went down for about 10 seconds.
Tony, did you need him to repeat it or?
Yeah, if he could, that would be great.
Okay, so I said that with the viaduct alternative, all the movements at those intersections would be allowed just like they are today.
Right.
So there'd be no change in that. But if you do one of the partial underpass alternatives that start to disallow certain movements, then that traffic has to go somewhere else. But any of the other movements that are still allowed, they would stay the same.
Right.
So
Okay.
the traffic on Alma would stay the same. The traffic on Charleston would stay the same. Traffic on Meadow would stay the same. In terms of the through volumes. So only certain turning movements would have to go somewhere else.
Yes, that answers it. Thank you, Gary.
Okay.
Okay, any other ex-cappers with a second bite at questions? Okay, well, hearing my fellow ex-cappers, I did have a few more questions. So Gary, do you believe the 2030 forecast numbers for the Churchill Parchin underpass, that they given that they're so close to what they are today, does that seem to make sense?
Well, yeah, to me, it does make sense because if you look at what the 2030 forecasts are based on, they're based on the anticipated growth in households and jobs in the city of Palo Alto. And those growth projections are very modest. I don't remember exactly what they are in terms of percentage increases, but they're pretty small. The general plan does not accommodate much growth in the city.
So if we had an increase in the amount of housing that was built, that would probably be a very lowball number. Is that an accurate statement?
The number,
If we built more housing in Palo Alto, then that would that beyond what's in the general plan right now, then that could impact those numbers. Just like if
Yeah,
we build.
yeah, it definitely would.
Yeah.
So these are based on the general plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with the proposed design for Churchill East, how many cars per hour could turn north and south, more or less?
Let me see if I understand your question. Churchill,
On the partial underpass,
yeah.
what do you think is the throughput on that partial underpass in terms of vehicles per hour? And because they're only turning left and right, right?
The volumes, the actual volumes are shown in the report. Is that what you wanted to look at, or?
Oh, yeah, I missed it. What page is that on?
Well, it's in the appendix. It was where we were before.
In the appendix, but on the church, because this has been updated since the last time you did the church. So is it in the report from November?
It should be in this one. I haven't gone looking, but. Where did you find that before?
Well, I didn't find it. That's why I was asking.
Oh, here. It's in Appendix C. So here's Churchill. Here's Meadows.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what the capacity would be, not theoretical capacity, not forecast capacity, but like the potential throughput.
The potential throughput on what street?
On Churchill for the.
Oh, Churchill.
Yeah, on
Sorry.
the north and southbound turns.
Okay, so we're looking at this, right?
Yes.
So let me see if I understand your question. So let's look at this page here. This is a 2030 AM. You're asking how many cars could go south and make a right turn?
Of the eastbound traffic, how many could turn north and south? Like what's the
what's the capacity? So we're showing 151 and 183.
per hour? That's the per hour capacity? That's the.
That's the actual volume. And then for the
I
PM, we're showing 214 and 284. So are you asking me what theoretically, how high could that number get?
Not theoretically, yeah, but more actually the potential throughput. Because I know that the theoretical capacity is different, right? I want what's the potential throughput there? So I know that the forecast says you'd only have whatever, 200 and something. But I guess theoretically then how many could go through that intersection?
Well, we haven't figured that out, I have to say. Okay. Whether, it could be much higher than that. Let's look at what the intersection level of service is there. Sorry for jumping around for people looking at the screen. This make you go crazy. But,
okay.
So the intersection in PM is level service C. So you could get probably a couple hundred more cars through there.
Okay, so like 200 more cars potentially?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, off the top of my head, yeah.
Which would be significant for that street.
It would be a huge increase, yeah.
Okay, okay. Okay, and then when you said that you're responding to Tony about that you don't think we need to worry about inducement down in Meadow and Charleston, or actually any of the intersections. I wanted to ask you about that, because doesn't that depend on the O&D, the origin and destination of where these cars are coming from? I mean, right now at Charleston, we have an asymmetrical traffic pattern, right? Most of the people in the morning are coming from, say, Mountain View. They make a westbound turn onto Charleston and they go out to whatever, VMware. And then in the evening, they do the opposite and come back. So it seems like they would be very, if you made that intersection a viaduct now and you don't have any more train preemption, then that makes that even a more efficient intersection and is more likely to induce cars. Like the asymmetrical traffic pattern seems to indicate you probably would be sensitive to big changes.
Well, the reason I say that there wouldn't be much induced travel is that in order to, cars are going to take the fastest route to get wherever they're going, whatever's the fastest way. That's how they tend to go. And so if they were on some other road now, what would be an example of where they would be instead? Let's say they're on Page Mill. And so now they're going to say, well, there's no, they don't get interrupted on Page Mill. So that's maybe not a good example, but just to kind of walk through it, whatever route they're on now, they would incur additional time to go to this new crossing, to go use this crossing, and then to go back to where they were before. So let's think of, okay, now cars are on Page Mill, and Page Mill's a pain, so they're going to go up and cross Churchill and then come back down to Oregon Expressway or something like that. So they have all the extra travel to go up to Churchill, and then all the extra travel to go back. So you would have to save a tremendous amount of time at the crossing to make up for all the detours that you would have to do to get to that crossing, when that crossing is not your natural path.
Yeah,
So
so I think
you can posit, well, there are some people that they're kind of in the middle, and they can go one way or the other way, and so they kind of have a choice. So the ones that have a choice are going to be more likely to use this one now because there's less delay than using this other one that they used to use.
Yeah,
But
I think the example I'm thinking of is not people who are necessarily detouring, but people who have a choice of where to turn.
exactly. That's what I was kind of getting to is, but when you parse it down to how many people really have a choice, there aren't that many that really have a choice. And
but it does depend on the split between local traffic versus longer cut through traffic, right?
well, yes, sort of, but if your trip takes, if you're a local trip, so it only takes 5 minutes, and you can go a different way and make it take 4 minutes, are you really going to bother? You might, because you know your way around. If you're regional traffic, you're not going to bother trying to save a minute by cutting through some other street.
So the locals are more likely to divert. Okay.
But honestly, I don't think we're talking about very much here in the way of potential induced travel.
Okay.
Usually when we talk about induced travel in our world, we talk about people that they used to travel at, say, 7 o'clock at night because it was too much of a pain to travel at 6. They'd really like to travel at 6 p.m., but it's such a pain they travel at 7. So if you make a bunch of improvements, now they travel at 6 instead of 7. So your traffic never gets any better. Or, they used to, take Caltrain, but now it's so fast to drive, they're not going to take Caltrain anymore, and they're going to drive instead. So that's what we usually talk about in terms of induced travel. But that kind of, if you save 5 seconds at a train crossing, it's not going to, cause you to drive instead of some other choice.
Well, but in the case of the train crossing, certainly the train crossings that exist today, right? It's not 5 seconds, right? You have the entire problem of the train preemption and how long it takes for the light to reset for all the movements. So, I mean, we inherently have this problem today where if you're a driver and you have the choice of, do I take Page Mill or Embarcadero that are grade separated, or do I wait at Churchill or Meadow or Charleston because I have to wait for a train? Like, that's a choice we all really live through every day here when we have got to get to various parts of town, depending on the time of day. The question I have is, when you make the intersection more efficient in the future, especially where Charleston is particularly a road where there's a lot of people going longer distances who happen to have to be on that road. The numbers aren't necessarily showing how much more inducement we'll have, and I get that that's not something necessarily we could capture, but I think it's a real thing. It would be a thing, for example, let's say we had a choice. We don't have a choice because Meadow and Charleston are near each other. But if you had a choice to only do one intersection and you wouldn't do another, then it would be logical that if you grade separated Charleston but not Meadow, cars would now take more cars would take Charleston, right?
Absolutely. Yes, I can 100% agree with you there.
Yeah.
But if you do them both,
right,
and to think that cars are going to, they're going to come from Page Mill or something like that, and they're going to use Meadow and Charleston because now you have an underpass there. I agree with you, there would be some that would do that, but just to kind of put in your back of your head, I would not think that that's going to be a really big number. Like, it's not going to double the traffic on Charleston or something if all of a sudden you have an underpass there.
So I have one last question, and then I want to, I see that Tony, you have your hand up, and then I'll go to public comment. But I did want to ask, I know that I was expecting that we were going to get sort of an update to the, I guess, whole traffic report. And I just had a question on the one that you had done in November. There's still an issue where the diagrams don't necessarily match what was sort of described. And I'm specifically, so on, I apologize, the numbers don't match. It's page 17 of the November part of the report.
Whoops.
And I don't have the PDF page because I have it printed, so.
So you're talking about this report?
Yes. And I think you just went past the page that I was talking about. Yep, stop around there, 16.
This is page 17, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So your bullet points there say install signals at Almond, Embarcadero, Slip Road Lamp, and have a controller. But then when you look at the picture on figure 8A and B, which is about 3 pages later, that doesn't, I think in one option you had the ability to have a left and a right turn if you were on the Embarcadero Slip Road. And that's not what the images show, right? Did we rectify that somewhere? Is that in the additional traffic sheet?
This is an excellent comment. These two drawings, 8A and 8B, do not exactly match the analysis that was done.
Okay.
In fact, 8A and 8B don't even match each other. So,
right. So that's confusing.
Okay.
And so when the analysis, yeah, I think it just should be noted, and I got to figure out a way for us to call that out in the reports, because anyone who looks at this is not if you're trying to read this traffic report, those probably don't go together.
Well, we can look into rectifying that. I don't know if it's too late, but
yeah, I don't know either, but I just think that one's important.
Yeah. Well, that's a good comment. That one has kind of been always kind of lurking in the background.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is we had given a comment a while back, and I don't know what direction you might have gotten, or maybe it's coming in a different AECOM form, but there was significant comments about including in the maps when we talk about anything related to traffic, of also showing the bike and pedestrian, actually specifically the bike maps and safe routes to schools maps, because as XCAP members, we don't all know those maps by heart, and it would be useful to be able to understand whether there's any interface between the diverted cars or even the new suggestions with the bike route. So for example, in that 8A and 8B, there is a bike route that's on the east side, basically the north side of Embarcadero, along Embarcadero. There's one on the south side as well, but the more heavily trafficked one is on the east side. And so there's a conflict that happens there. I'm looking at 8B where the picture of the red truck is coming off High Street. The bikes pass in front of the cars there, right? And so we don't have anything in the maps or in the reports that sort of indicates where we have these moments of conflict between cars and established safe routes to schools things. I see that Philip has appeared. Philip, do you have anything to tell us about those?
Hi, no, I don't have anything new to add, but I'll look to see if there's a way. I'm not sure if it's other than just including the safe routes to school maps and also our bike and ped, our current bike maps. So I'll look into that and see if there's an opportunity for it, and I'll also see if AECOM has any thoughts for how we can incorporate. But I just want to say that the one thing we don't want to do is add too many things onto these maps.
No, yeah, I understand. But in terms of the analysis, right, it's really difficult to understand when you're talking about, okay, how is Embarcadero doing on those streets there when you've got these globs of kids coming, and I don't know at what rate and how that might impact the crossings, the way the intersection works, how the kids are being routed safely. And I think that, we've heard from the neighbors. I know that we've had at least one set of neighbors who sent a specific letter on this. It's something that still really hasn't been addressed, and it's gonna, part of accepting the proposed mitigations is understanding the bike ped connections. I don't think we have a super clear picture, especially in this area.
Yeah, I wonder if we could just potentially put them as additional exhibits. in along with these things.
But it's not just adding the maps. I think understanding that trying to understand what the impacts of having globs of bikes going through at peak hour will do to that intersection, right?
Well, are you talking about that you would like to see the bike lanes added to this picture, like this 8B, for example?
We're showing roads and we're showing that we're going to be changing things, and there's going to be bikes, especially safe route to schools, being impacted. I think that that's an important thing. And I think it'll help when people give bike ped comments, because they'll be like, oh yeah, that's right, I do ride that at this time of day, and this is what kind of happens, right? So there's that phenomenon, but there's also understanding, you now have this thing where if you're adding a light there, that you're now making all of these bikes, and I don't know how many there are, but let's say they're on the north side of Embarcadero. When the light turns red, now these bikes are gathering there, similar to what happens today at Churchill. And depending on the time of day, you can have 100, 200 bikes that gather there. And so if that is causing now this group of bikes, when the light changes, how do they then get across and then get down the more narrow part of the underpass where they have their bike ped path? And we don't really have any understanding of what that pooling of bikes does as a result of these new intersections. Does that help?
Yeah, I think we could show one way to do that would be to show the bike kind of path of travel on here, and
any bike numbers that we have. I don't know if we have bike counts at that intersection specifically, because I think when TDJKM, whatever all the letters were, when they did their counts, I don't know that they counted bikes right there. But a new thing that happens when you place a light here is now we have a different potential bike issue that hasn't been resolved.
We'll see if we have any counts of bikes at this particular location.
Yeah, because understanding what happens when you put a light there and how they pool, and is there enough landing space? These are inexperienced bikers, so they, when they gather, they kind of lean sideways. They're not super neat about it, just because I think that I suspect when this goes to the town halls, or when it goes to PAUSD, or when it goes out back to the bike community, we're going to get questions about those intersections. So I know it's not part of the newer part of the report, but it is something that I think is outstanding and hasn't really been addressed. So with that, we have members of the public who would like to speak. So I'm going to take some public comment now. And ex-cappers, if you have any other questions, if you could jot those down, so when I bring it back, we can get our final questions into Gary, so we can move on, because we've got still a big agenda.
You want me to stop sharing?
Yes, that'd be great, because we need to do public comment and we need the timer. Awesome. So it looks like we have 2 speakers. I will let the Jose take it over, I think it was.
Yeah, we have 2 people who raised their hands. First,
Great.
We have Eduardo Latch, followed by Jason Stinson. Just here. Okay, Eduardo, it is your turn to speak.
I'm assuming you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Nadia, to address your question, page 39 of the item 3A traffic report has the numbers of the traffic going in and out of Churchill. It is a total of 706 cars in the AM and 776 cars in the PM. So that's 7 times the noticeable number that you mentioned before. If you do the underpass and remove the east-west flow, the numbers go down to 600 in the morning and 670 in the evening. There's about 100 cars that go from north and south. Majority of cars are cutting through Churchill. So again, it's 600 cars with the underpass, 706 to 776 cars right now. What I wanted to talk to you, I am pro closing Churchill, and I really want to thank you for all the amazing work that you are doing. I wanted to comment on the fact that you have included the noise information in the report, and I wanted to point out that not closing Churchill, if for whatever reason we decide not to close it, will mean that that the noise level is about 15 decibels higher, which is, since the logarithmic scale is 3 times the noise. That means that our neighbors in Mariposa will be getting hit hard by the noise at the beginning, mostly because of the horns and everything else. Talking about the traffic report, I wanted to point out that again, not closing Churchill would increase the time waited on Alma to 127 seconds from the current 23 seconds estimated if you close Churchill. That's a significant number. It's 100 seconds more. Lastly, I know I'm running out of time. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your work.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jason Stinson, followed by Terry Latch. All right. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So two quick things. I also had the same questions that Mr. Shen had about tables 1, 2, 3, and 4 about the delay numbers between viaduct and partial. Thanks, Mr. Black, for answering those, what the difference is. I just wanted to point out that now that we understand that the reason that the partial has better numbers than the viaduct is because the viaduct basically has a traffic light there and has all movement available, versus the partial underpass, which blocks a lot of that traffic and creates, straight pass-throughs. If you were to look at the Churchill tables 1 and 2, I assume you included a traffic light at Churchill, even though Churchill was closed, which wouldn't make sense anymore. And so it would actually I think would actually look better in terms of the numbers if you didn't have the traffic light there relative to the partial underpass, because you would just have traffic flowing north and south on Alma all the time, which would make it look a lot more like the partial underpass. In fact, I think it would look better because your northbound traffic, your southbound traffic wouldn't have to hit a light anymore. The second thing is, I think Ms. Nyack brought up, I don't think any of us realized that traffic inducement wasn't in here. I know we had a very rich discussion about that. I'm going to respectfully disagree a lot with Mr. Black about there not being really any difference between traffic inducements. I'm surprised that you're not looking at this as a holistic system. Whether it's fluid dynamics or electrical analysis, reducing the resistance on a route is going to incur more traffic, particularly at the Churchill crossing, where, as I think the previous speaker talked about, 70% of the traffic is cut through. It is trying to cut through to northbound Alma or southbound El Camino, or trying to get onto Page Mill, or basically it's all cut through traffic. If you make that resistance lower, there's going to be significantly more traffic there. I'm surprised that that wasn't included in the study. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's see, our next speaker is Terry Latch. Please unmute yourself.
There you go. Hi, everybody. So Jason and Eduardo have much more intricate comments to each of the pages. I apologize for not reading that as thoroughly, but I did want to comment to one thing as you guys were discussing, similar to Jason, the cut through traffic and the fact that if you eliminate the barriers at Churchill, there will be more traffic. I have personal experience from my family being in Menlo Park of them not even thinking about Churchill 20 years ago as a cut through, but now using it as a cut through. My sister teaches at Sacred Heart, lives in Fremont, and she actually uses Churchill as her cut through. She doesn't stop to say hello to me, by the way, but she uses Churchill as her cut through. So she's getting to 101, and I know much of that traffic, as Jason said, is cut through. We will get more of that. And, again, all of us are okay with a busy street. We're not okay with a freeway in front of our house because it's not safe for the families, for the kids, for the school, for anybody. So I'm not only going to take a minute, but I concur with Jason that there will be significant amount of increase of traffic. So I'm very much for the closure of Churchill. There are quite a few other crossings that people can use, and we don't need to spend the money on the Churchill one. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Drew, followed by Richard Berkey.
Hello there. So quickly, unfortunately, I don't have the report open at the moment. There's, I think, one diagram that there's an arrow that needs to be shifted. This is a diagram that deals with the undercrossing scenario. So you can't go through Churchill all the way to the east side, but you go under the tracks, turn right or left. And so if you turn left and go north, on this drawing, it's trying to show how the traffic disperses out with the change. And there's a red arrow that, I believe it's a red arrow that has a right turn on Kellogg. And I think that's an impossible maneuver. And if I remember about a month ago in this presentation, part of that was it was just supposed to be a loose it wasn't supposed to be completely accurate related to what the traffic actually could do. But when I looked at this report again and looked at that, I just think that's really confusing because that turn, there's a barrier. There's no way you could come up from Churchill and make a right onto Kellogg. So I hope that's clear enough to find that chart. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Richard, you're next. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to comment. In the diagrams that are looking at the diverted traffic, the through traffic under the partial underpass, I live in the old Palo Alto neighborhood, and just like 4B, the expectation that all of the through traffic on a westbound direction is destined to go north, and so we'll all go down to Embarcadero. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me since much of that traffic is headed south on El Camino. So I would expect that traffic to instead wander through the old Palo Alto network neighborhood to get to Oregon Expressway. And just a similar comment on the left-hand turn traffic, while not large numbers, the 60 left-hand turn that in this example in 4C is turning with a light during the peak hour traffic. When that traffic is diverted and finds its way on the other residential streets like Lowell, Tennyson, and Seal to make that left-hand turn, those left-hand turns are virtually impossible during both the evening and morning due to the amount of through traffic just going whizzing by. It's a stop sign, it's not a traffic light. So two, that traffic is going to have to wander through the neighborhood to find some alternative method south. One that is not provided, it really, the partial underpass, because it has no other improvements at either Oregon Expressway or Embarcadero for Alma, really leaves the neighborhood with an inability to get out onto Alma southbound direction with a traffic signal. Basically, during the day, non-peak hour, it's usually pretty safe and easy to do, but during peak hours, both morning and afternoon, you just simply can't make those turns safe. That's my comment. Thanks.
Okay, that concludes our public speakers.
Great, thank you. Gary, I did want to agree with one of the speakers. So Drew pointed out in figure 4A, you have the diverted traffic turning, this is for Churchill, you have folks that would be going eastbound on Churchill are now turning. And in 4A, the turn onto Kellogg is not possible because there's still a barrier there.
We can make that correction. I was not aware that there was a barrier there.
Yeah, so if you're coming from under the underpass, you don't get up in time to be able to make that right turn because you'd be running into the traffic that's on grade along Alma.
Oh, you mean under the, I thought you were saying that there's an existing barrier there.
No, we're saying that proposed.
Yeah, the design, yeah, Peter's design carries, carries a barrier up that, yeah.
Yeah, so I would have to agree with that. And then second, I would just like to suggest for the record what the last speaker was talking about. I also live in Old Palo Alto, and it is true that trying to make a unsignalized left out of our neighborhood without the light at Churchill becomes very difficult. And so I would probably recommend that we consider a traffic signal at Northern California, which would make it easier for, that's also a hairy intersection anyway, because it's right as people along Alma are getting down into Page Mill. And I think it was something that the previous traffic consultants had looked at some point. But just for pure safety reasons, my experience would be that would make sense. So I'll just throw that into there. It's not that I'm suggesting that you change it in your report. I just wanted to say that for my fellow ex-cappers, when we discuss traffic mitigations, that's one I'd like to throw in there for thought. Okay, I think with that, do we have any other ex-cappers who have anything else? No, all right, seeing none. Gary, thank you so much for your traffic report. And I think we can move on to the next item, our matrix. Okay, so we have from AECOM, we have an updated matrix, and then we have Carrie who's going to be presenting her version of a matrix that she developed that's intended to help ex-cappers kind of come up with their recommendations. So I guess I don't know if it's Millette or Peter, whoever's going to do or Elliot. I don't know who's doing the evaluation matrix, but I'll turn it over to you guys.
Yeah, hi, this is Millette Blitzinger from AECOM, and I'll do just a brief introduction. On the first page of the item 4A documents that you have, we did kind of do a general summary of the changes that we made to the fact sheets. I'm not going to go through each of these row by row, but I did want to highlight some of the general ones that we did. We did update the legend to include a neutral position, which was a comment that we had there, which is represented by a black square. And then we did change how the coloring was used to improve their readability. So we included this bar legend to show what level on the legend that you would be on, and whether it was an improvement or an impact. And then, that allowed us to, make all the fonts the same size. And then we added that, extended the page limit on those sheets too, so that the text size is more readable. We did incorporate the comment about adding the Caltrain right-of-way, and we added that as the Caltrain right-of-way impacts, and we added that as row Q on the exhibits. And then because of that, we had to move the design exceptions to row R. And then we also did add a footnote to all the sheets indicating that the color ranking was a comparison between each alternative within the grade separation options and not across locations. So with that, I'm able to try to reply to questions or answer questions if needed.
Sure. Carrie?
Hi, I just want to say that I really like the improvements in readability. This is way better for me, and I'm sure for many others. And I like the key, whatever the each
the
row
legend.
is. Each row in the legend. So however it is you're indicating the degree of impact is really a huge improvement. So thank you for working on this.
Thank you.
Any other ex-cappers? I see Dave.
Yeah, I want to also say that I agree with Carrie. Boy, this is a lot easier to look at, and the neutral is really good too to throw in there. Were any of the rankings changed from the last time?
Yes, they were.
Because it looked like some things were still not changed, or maybe you disagreed with some of the comments we made. If it's okay with you guys, I'd like to just point out some things that still confuse me. On the Churchill evaluation criteria, thanks for switching that to closure plus mitigations. And however, it's still interesting to me that the closure plus mitigations, row A, is two oranges. And then, yes, I do recognize that you do, in B, you say, well, it is going to be mitigated and that kind of thing. But then that's also confusing if you go across to the partial underpass where there's no through traffic. So some turning elements aren't there, but yet it gets a maximal blue count. And so some of these just, I don't know, like if we're going to rate closure plus mitigations together, then it would seem to me that row A should be something much better than two oranges. So anyway, that's one comment.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, continue on with your comments, but We did we took into consideration, the idea was through movement across the corridor, which we, felt like that was related to the Caltrain crossing. So, with the closure, yes, you do have detour routes that mitigate you, but you don't have that crossing that goes across the grades, across Caltrain. So that was definitely one of the reasons we ranked that lower. We also took into account, I believe, some of the pedestrian routes too, and providing those crossings, direct crossings.
Yeah, but still, it seems like it got worse than before. And when compared to the partial underpass, I mean, we lost a bunch of turning movements there. And so, I don't know, it just seems like it's not quite consistent that the Churchill closure plus mitigations together is knocked down a little bit further than it should, if you will. Okay. So row E then, we have, I'm wondering why the cost at $50 to $65 million for the closure is the same orange square that we see for the partial underpass, which is, over 3 times more expensive than that. And it would seem like there should be some indication of that.
Yeah, that does look a little bit out of sorts. I would agree with that.
And then moving to Metal Charleston. Row B across from Trench to Tunnel Passenger and Freight. I was wondering why it wouldn't be 3 blues, because don't we get all turning movements in these cases? We're just putting the tracks elsewhere. Like I'm wondering why is it?
B, is that what you said?
Yes, row B, yes.
For which alternative?
From Trench through South Palo Alto Tunnel, Passenger and Freight. So those 4. Because the train is completely separated from those, and there's just a light there. And so wouldn't that just give all those 3 ranking for those in that row?
So I did look at the traffic report and the level of service that it was provided. And I think if you look at level of service, the underpass functions a bit better than the others from a level of service standpoint.
Oh, I see. You're comparing to that, which does have some through traffic that's not blocked by the light. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And I think that might be it. Thanks. Yeah, it looks much better. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other ex-cappers? Okay. I wanted to say, yeah, I agree that this looks way better. I love that there's not as much color on it. I do think it makes the readability much better. I think I'm with Dave on the Churchill evaluation closure. So row A for Churchill evaluation criteria. So I don't know, to me, it feels like closure plus mitigation should be maybe 1 orange, and the partial underpass should also just be 1 orange. I feel like they're pretty close, and this kind of makes them seem pretty separated. But my general comment is that this is difficult, and this is part of the reason why it's not easy to do, because I think it depends whether you're thinking about pedestrians or you're thinking about cars, or in the case of the partial underpass, yes, there's limited turn movements, but the amount of turn movements that are limited relative to the amount of traffic at that intersection and the way that intersection functions is also what makes you think about the rating differently. And so I wonder, Millette, did you guys consider the traffic study at all in choosing the coloring for A, or did you have that more represented in the other one that talks about providing movement across the board?
In B, we consider that more in row B of the alternatives. And yes, it is. Elliot, Peter, and I were on a very long phone call going through this by line and adding our viewpoints. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. So
we felt like the closure mitigations really should be docked per se, because it's, you know, it's not providing that movement. And that's what the evaluation criteria states: facilitate movement. And the closure doesn't facilitate that movement. So we thought that deserved a lower rating.
It does for bikes and peds though, right? So that's why I
Sure.
think when we talk about Carrie's matrix afterwards, I think that's what she has the benefit of being able to break out those ideas. But in yours, yeah, it's kind of why it's a mixed bag, right? Because it's hard to say for which. I did want to ask one question about the cost, because when I was rereading through the traffic study, I saw that part of the mitigations is the adding a lane to all the Embarcadero overpass or existing underpass. And I couldn't remember, I'm assuming that that's included in the mitigation costs, but do we have a real sense of how expensive it is to add that to an existing very old bridge, or was that in the mitigation costs?
Yes, we did include.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay. Do we have any other ex-cappers? Oh, I had one more statement. So I think the sentence that you added about that the color of the matrix is comparative between each alternative and not across all grade separations. I think I have one minor tweak, which is the color of the matrix is comparative between each alternatives within a geography. Because I think I knew what you were trying to say because we'd had the discussion, but if you don't know this as well as we do, we're basically trying to say that a viaduct in Churchill is not the same as a viaduct in Meadow Charleston. And I think anything that can delineate that would be helpful. So that's my suggested language. You can do otherwise, but I think that helps make it clear.
How about instead of within the geography at this location?
Sure, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Already, yeah, each location, exactly. Okay, awesome. Well, so the way we have this agendized, guys, we would talk about this and then we'll talk about Carrie's matrix and then we go to public comment. So if you have anything else to say about this matrix, now would be a really good time, because otherwise we're sort of going to shift mentally to Carrie's matrix and then take public comment.
I appreciate that it's more readable, so thanks for all the hard work on it. I still struggle as to how, as an ex-cap, we're going to go through all of these one item at a time, which I think Carrie has some proposals for. So,
Tony, I see your hand up.
Yes, so the question is, how does this matrix relate to what we're going to do next, and how do they talk to each other?
Obviously it's up for discussion, but this evaluation matrix has been used by the city in all of their town halls and such. So I assumed that we were tweaking this because this is what basically the city will be using for their presentations. We as an ex-cap, when we move to Carrie's, can have a discussion about, how do we feel Carrie's is different, and whether or not, I think Carrie's, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie, but it was more designed for ex-cap to be able to think through their deliberations. It wasn't designed as a replacement of what AECOM and the city have done to the existing matrix. Is that correct, Carrie?
Yes, that's correct. The one that I'm going to present is interactive and electronic, and maybe not as suitable, but we can discuss it, maybe not as suitable for the purposes that AECOM's presentation at community meetings. So however, this matrix that I'll present is informed by and based on the matrix that we have all been looking at that AECOM just tweaked. I don't have the new tweaks in it, but that's my understanding.
Does that make sense, Tony? Tony?
Yeah, I can't hear. Oh yeah, now I can hear. Okay. So the idea is to work with, let's say if we agree, work with Carrie's matrix and then transfer the information that we come up with as a group, as ex-cappers, transfer that information to the city's matrix. Is that the idea?
Not necessarily. I think the city's matrix, the AECOM matrix that we're working on, basically we're trying to give our feedback right now. And unless we have some stunning revelation as a result of Carrie's matrix, it will stay as it's been presented, outside of whatever we just discussed. Carrie's one is more for our internal deliberations and that we can use, and as Carrie said, for it to be a dynamic tool that we use when we start to talk about what's going on. But it wouldn't change anything that we're doing to Carrie's matrix would not imply a change in the AECOM city matrix. At least that's not how we envisioned it. It's certainly up for discussion. If the group felt, oh, we found something that absolutely has to be added, sure. But it's probably not, is my guess.
So are they two parallel studies, or?
Well, one is the city's matrix, the one that we just discussed. That's what's going to be, if this was a live town hall, they'd be printing that, they'd be handing those out. That's sort of the official one. The one that Carrie made is the one that ex-cappers are going to use when we talk.
So let me jump in here. Tony, I think what you're asking is if we were to change a rating or a grading of each cell as part of our discussions on the dynamic matrix, would we then be able to update the static matrix that AECOM has created? Is that your question?
Right, that's the question.
Let's talk about that. I don't want to go off track, but that's exactly the kind of discussion we want to have when we go to agenda item 4B.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Tony. Larry?
Well, I think since Greg and Tony brought up the point, I think now is really the time to discuss it. As I see it,
Sure.
AECOM report and the staff's input on that are theirs. And we've given feedback and asked them to improve or change in various ways, but it's still their report. If to choose an example, that Dave had suggested the one area should be a little different color, and Millette has indicated maybe she doesn't agree with him. That's fine. It's AECOM's report, and we will work with it. And so there's no need for us to accept or reject any portions of AECOM's report. We will use it as we see fit as we move forward in making our recommendations. And Carrie's very good work, and as I said before all of you got on, I think we deserve a lot of thumbs up for Carrie for a great job. It's a tool for us to use in coming up with our recommendations to the council. And if great kudos to her for developing it. But if somebody else wanted to come up with something else or have it just for his own or her individual purposes, that's okay too. Because they're not going to be part of the official report, except maybe as an exhibit saying, the council, you may want to consider this as you analyze this and make your decision on our recommendations. But for us to go forward and try to say we agree or not with each of the recommendations, I counted a little over 800 cells on Carrie's chart. Now, agreed, most of them wouldn't be very controversial, but I just can't imagine that we're going to review 800 different cells and decide whether we agree or disagree on that. And once we disagree on, even if we only had controversy over 50 of them, we're going to be here forever. But I think that the general idea of the framework is one that organizations use all the time. Consultant comes up with a report, fine, it's their report. We'll take it into account. We'll make our decisions, and in our report, we'll say why we made our recommendations. And the consultant's report is an exhibit to our final report. But it's just part of the entire package. So I think that we want to consider what Carrie has to say and hers, and move on.
Thanks for that, Larry. Anybody else have anything on the AECOM matrix, for lack of a better word, until we move to dynamic matrix? Okay, so seeing none, Carrie, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can show us your baby. Hard on.
Well, yes, this was definitely not made in a vacuum, but I'm really excited to share this with everybody. So there's a memo attached that hopefully you've had a chance to review. The goal of this is exactly as Nadia and Larry described, to help us make our decision and document our decision. We've had a lot of challenges with the matrix that was presented, although many areas have been improved. I think there's still some things that we can continue to improve upon. So we really wanted to make this process more transparent and easier to document, easier to compare across the different alternatives that are presented, and ultimately to be able to roll up and justify our recommendation on each of the criteria that council provided. The caveats here, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to eliminate our need to evaluate things that are just inherently different, and to choose which one we want to recommend. And all of the choices that I made during the drafting of this structure are up for discussion. It's not something that is set in stone. The whole idea is, what will we choose to discuss? As Larry mentioned, there are a lot of choices we have to make. What will we choose to discuss, and how can we come to an agreement together? So these are a starting point, and it's up to us to improve it. So is it possible for whoever's presenting to show this item, or should I present, or how does?
Can she share her screen? Question for Sarah, and maybe Philip might know.
Yes, she can.
Great.
Share her screen. Yeah, if you feel comfortable with it, Carrie.
Yes, I will give it a try. I think this is it. Let's see. Okay, are you seeing this? Sections, criteria, etc.?
Yes.
Okay. So just to quickly go over some things that will help orient us, and then I'll demo the matrix. Things we were hoping to address, and I'm looking for feedback on, are readability, clarifying the requirements, being consistent across the alternatives, being more usable and accessible, adding in a user focus, understanding the criteria and what they mean better, and how firm each of the criteria is. The level of impact is here called severity, and then being able to say what we prefer, and being able to print for people at home. Just one other note here, one of the crossings, the Meadow Charleston crossing, fits on a 11 by 17 paper. You may not be able to print that at home without splitting it across 2 sheets. And then we have 3 sections: the council criteria, engineering challenges, and then a new section, which I'll show you when we go through it, which is exactly these same criteria above, but grouped by who may be interested, so that it would be easier for us to empathize with the different perspectives and to document what perspectives we looked at. And then the dynamic part, we can collapse and expand kind of sub-criteria, or we can collapse and expand the notes on those dimensions. And then the choices part, this is all up for discussion, and I think that AECOM just provided some additional ways to look at how we want to rank or rate things. Some things that are objective, you either meet it or you don't as a criteria. Some that are subjective, we have, good, okay, poor, preferred or not, and then not applicable and unknown. Some of these, this limits it. It only has 3 really tightly grouped options, and then when we make a decision, we can say preferred or not recommended. So that may or may not be enough. That's one thing we'll talk about. And then level of severity, and then some discussion items. So if you want to open up to the discussion items, we can get into details of what do you think about the options? What do you think about the personas? what do we need to combine, if anything? What more do we need to break out? Do we have, then we get into details like, do we have the right rating or not? And that may be a much longer discussion. Okay, so let me see if I can bring this other matrix over so we can take a look at it. If I go to this tab, are you able to see the matrix, or do I need to reshare?
Oh, we can see it.
Okay, so this is a Google spreadsheet, and it has 4 tabs. One is the original charts from AECOM. One is for Churchill and one is for Meadow Charleston. So I'm going to start with Churchill. Maybe it's still loading. I don't know what's happening. Okay, so these little toggles on the top and in each row are how we can change what view we have. So just to give you an example, if we collapse everything, all the rows and the sub criteria, we'll have a view that's very similar to the matrix we got from AECOM. And if you expand the notes, it's almost exactly the same information, right? It's a lot to fit on the screen or on the page, but it's all there. So you can do, this is helpful because you might want to, you know, after you've agreed on how you want to rate these, and you can have a choice here of what you might want to put, then you can have notes here that explain what the discussion was in the rating, but then you can hide them later so that you don't always have to look at the notes once the rating is agreed to. So this is helpful to get an overall view. But how do you arrive at your rating for each alternative? When we had the criteria, there were some notes here, and I just took those and broke those out. So Churchill will be close to vehicles, grade separated. So that's exactly anything that our consultants or staff has identified in the notes. I've kind of broken out into sub-criteria. So instead of A, which combines all of it, it's A1, A2, A3. Does that make sense? Okay. So then we're able to imagine when we're deliberating, which we're not doing right now, but imagine that we then can kind of roll this up and say, well, we've met a criteria here, but we have poor here or not applicable here. What would that overall rating be? And this will be part of our discussion and we can change it, but we have, you know, the ability to break out, as I think Dave brought up earlier, oh, well, this is different in this way and this is different in that way. How are we comparing apples and oranges? This might be a way to do that. So that was the intent behind this. What we would need to do with the XCAP members is to determine if all of the relevant criteria are listed and to add ones if they're not. We also have the opportunity for each criteria to determine, is it a constraint, which means the project can't proceed if this constraint is not met, or is it a need, something we really prefer, or a want, right? And so being able to specify that will allow us to weigh different aspects differently, different requirements differently. And so we've done that with each of these all the way down. And the engineering, oh, okay, there's a lot of color coding here. We can change all that very easily. So if you're very uninterested in seeing the color coding, we have the words here. We don't necessarily need the color coding, or we could change it to match AECOM's new color scheme, whatever. That's all very flexible. But just to understand these criteria, we have a color code of green for the council criteria, blue for engineering challenges. And you'll see that down here in engineering, we have a different set. This is the severity drop-down options that we had are being used in engineering. So we just understand the impact. And that's different than the criteria we had for some more subjective things. So in some cases, we don't have a lot of detail about, like, for example, utility relocations. We don't have a lot detail broken out here? Does it matter if it's a phone pole versus a sewer line, right? It might. We may want to break that out. I don't know. But right now that one is doesn't have a lot of sub criteria. And then let's see if my computer will respond. And then we broke out different types of personas so that we can discuss them. And this may not be comprehensive. These are just the ones that I recall encountering in our public comment and other discussions. Is we have different modes of transit. So we have car drivers, bike riders, pedestrians, and public transit users. We have locations of the residents. Does this project or this alternative have a different experience or rating for those who live right on the tracks versus those who are, say, commuting in Palo Alto or don't have as close a proximity to the tracks? And then what organizations have we consulted and heard their feedback, right? So businesses, the school system, Caltrain. And then I added this one about city public safety. I don't know. We've brought it up, but we never really documented it anywhere in the matrix. So how does the information get down here? So you'll see here this little code. If you type in a criteria's reference number into here, then all of these will just copy over from that line item. So you don't have to rate them again. So hopefully that will help with the at least a few hundred of these cells that Larry was mentioning. So anything in this purple section is copied down, but it's grouped together so that we can say, okay, what is this experience like going to be for car drivers versus pedestrians? I can't promise that I have all the right ones. This is just a starting point, but we've been able to say which of the criteria above relate to these. And then you can also see which one are council criteria versus, let's see if I can find one with engineering criteria. Here's one. So in case you were wondering, we have a very light, hard to see, but it's present, color coding here, so you know which kind of criteria it is at a glance. All right, so I think that's everything in terms of the technical aspects of what I was trying to convey. I'm interested in feedback. I will stop.
Larry,
Should I stop presenting?
No, you can keep it on. So I think
okay.
we can ask you questions. Larry, your hand was up, but I don't know if it was up from before or not.
That was from before.
Okay, great. I see Dave's hand and then Phil and then Greg.
Okay, great, thanks. Carrie, like I said before, this is pretty awesome work. I can't believe you did it in, I don't know, 1 or 2 days that I thought you did it in. Two comments come to mind. One is first the severity. I really like the addition of the black neutral, like no change. So I'd advocate adding that into the severity. Then my other comment was, did you have any thoughts about how we would go about getting this persona responses?
My expectation was that it would be agendized and we would come up with a set of personas that were going to be included. That way we would be able to get public feedback, but I'm open to other suggestions as well.
Yeah, I was thinking like, let's say it's about the closure, right? We have people in Southgate, we have people in Old Palo Alto, for example. It could be by region of the city. There could be divisions within those regions too. So I was just wondering about all that.
That's true. I don't think that we're going to be able to use this structure to avoid that conversation. You know what I mean? Like we're going to have to rate it and take a note, right? If there's a division in how, pedestrians feel about the partial underpass, then we would need to document that and ultimately come up with a rating as the XCAP. Yeah, I mean, we're still going to have those kinds of discussions. I think like it's going to be easier to narrow down those conversations though by understanding which parts are receiving the most energy of disagreement, right? So that right now is confused when we have all the criteria lumped into A or O or whatever it is, right? So if we can break it out, we'll understand where the difference is and hopefully be able to narrow that down, capture it, and make a decision.
No, I love the intent. I just am not sure how to get there.
Yeah.
And also may not even be our mission. We may not have time to kind of spearhead that effort, I guess, too.
Yeah, if I could just say, Dave, the intent is really to help us get through the stickier conversations, but it's not to make this thing perfect. In other words, we're not going to all decide, okay, this definitely has to be a red, because the point is not to make the chart. The point is for us to get to the recommendation. And I think Carrie's tool is designed to help us think through those. And to Carrie's point, like if we can't all agree, okay, if someone lives near the tracks versus what other Palo Alto residents might think, that's probably a good thing to know. And so this will help sort of just highlight that there's a lot of energy around a particular conflict, but it doesn't mean we're going to necessarily resolve a box color or a word. But it might mean that it'll help us understand that section of the report or that particular thing might have some extra verbiage because we couldn't, we have energy around that. I think that's really what this is aimed at.
Cool, thank you.
I see Phil and then Greg.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so first, Carrie, I'm completely blown away by this work. I mean, it's incredible. Second, I think the addition of personas is hugely helpful because we've always had some implicit notion of persona discussions when we talk about where people live or what kind of transportation they use. This makes it explicit. So that said, we'll never get these personas built out the way, quote, we would like to. There's just not the time or the resource. But that doesn't matter because we're still way better off having this explicit than if we didn't have this at all. So that's why I'm so impressed by this work.
Well, thank you.
And yes, there will be some discussions about what the persona is. And as Nadia said, that doesn't eliminate these, but it's going to be far more focused than we would have had otherwise.
Thanks, Phil. That would be Greg next. And if Larry and Phil, if you guys have already spoken, can you put your hand down for me so I don't lose my track there? Thank you.
Yeah, and I what I really like about this is that at the end of something, it's actually possible to distill some of these decisions down into a page. I'm trying to bring up the right page, but I really like sort of that the top level is a page that a human can understand, because even the revised AECOM matrix, which is they've done a ton of work on, and it's got a ton of information, and it's a lot better than it used to be. It's still more than a human can digest. Whereas this, you can actually imagine having a conversation about this. And of course, the question is how to go forward. I can't imagine we're going to sit in 96 consecutive hours of XCAP meetings and debate each individual row. I think, at one point, I think Carrie had suggested maybe breaking up into subgroups, or finding some way to, submit requests electronically to one or two people to be voted on during a meeting or something. But I think that, we need to find a way to all be comfortable enough with what's in the underlying sheets so we can use these top level summaries to actually, make a deliberation and make a recommendation. So, and like everyone else, yeah, thanks a ton for doing this. I think this helps a lot.
Thanks, Greg. Tony?
So yes, just like everyone else, thank you very much, Carrie. This really allows us to discuss and crystallize our thinking. So I'm looking forward to moving forward and going cell by cell. I think, like Larry, it'd be difficult, but I would imagine doing subgroups or all of us ideally together, zipping through it. I would make one last plea for using numbers instead of poor, good, or not so good. Because later on we can add them, and like one person did, I think it's Mr. Miller, who sent us a addition. He's divided it into +3 and -3 because there's 6 categories. But my plea is to use numbers because the criteria are not equally valuable or weighted, and right now we're weighting it equally. So down the road it would really help, but I won't make this plea again for a while. Thank you. And thank you again, Carrie, really well done.
Thank you. Yes, so to bring the group up to speed, earlier, and I mean like maybe 6 or 9 months ago, I tried to formulate a way to do this that we could form an actual score so that we could, translate the weighting with the constraint need want column and translate the scoring into, the ratings into a score that would, really help streamline the process. The challenge we hit was that there's a lot of subjective decisions still to be made, and it was very it became quickly clear in my experiment, though I would encourage others to please explore this, that it would be, we would be here forever if we went down that path of having an objective score on a subjective item. So I don't know if Nadia, if you want to speak to that as well, but this is the next iteration once I personally came to the direction that we probably couldn't come up with a score in our time window.
Yeah, I would agree. Ultimately, what ended up happening, Tony, was we gave things a score, and then when something scored higher than the other, and it didn't really jive with what we were thinking, we found ourselves trying to tweak the values of the different things to make the scores make sense with what we thought. And ultimately, since if we didn't agree, then we couldn't even agree on the scoring. So we ended up in the same place. So I think, the real thing is at the end of the day, we're writing a report with words for a reason, because there is no really obvious answer. There is no obvious mathematical answer. That is exactly why this group was impaneled. And we're going to have to describe in words the pros and cons of all of these things. And I think the beauty of what Carrie has created here is it allows us to refine within the council's criteria, there's a lot of nested ideas, and we're able to kind of pull out what are the salient things in each idea. So for instance, if there's a difference between in a crossing for pedestrians versus cars, Carrie's model helps us pull those thoughts out. And you wouldn't want to be in a position where you rate something higher or lower because it's bikes or peds, because I think depending on who you are, that matters, right? So yeah, that's why we're still not doing numbers, but I appreciate you trying.
Regarding the process to rate them, I would argue we could probably get through quite a bit efficiently in a full meeting if we chose to go that route, because some things are, when they're broken out by line item, are pretty clear. That's not to say everything, but it's not that we'll need to debate every cell. And then once in a line item, if you have things that go together, coming up with that roll-up rating is then easier. And one more thing I didn't demo, but here's an example of how we could use the not recommended option, like we did with the South Palo Alto tunnels. They're there, we have ratings, and once we've decided to not include that in recommendations, we can just indicate that wherever it is that we decide to do that. So I think it's not going to be as contentious as if we were just doing a row by itself. Once we have the sub criteria, that may be a longer discussion. For example, maybe How would we want people to give feedback if additional criteria were, if they thought there was maybe should be a C number 4 or something like that? Just email.
Yeah, I think we're going to take public comment today, and then we have some time until we start deliberating. And so hopefully by the time we get to that point, we can as a group discuss the feedback that we got and take it from there. Because ultimately, again, any feedback we're getting from the public is really just, you know, whether the XCAP thinks is going to be useful, because we're just using this to deliberate and not necessarily to provide to council or anything. Of course, we could ultimately, but, and so I feel like there will be, you know, certainly we can hear from the public in that way.
Okay, great.
Okay, I think Phil and Greg, I see your hands up, but I think those are from before.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention numbers. I'm a little worried. Yeah,
I'm muting.
Okay, I'm just a little worried. I think there's going to be a tendency with this to assign every row a number, to add them up, and then to come back to us or the city council and say, you know, they said X, but X is 27 and Y is 28. And I think this is, in the end of the day, this is a subjective process. This is not something we're going to be able to 100% reduce to a number. And I'd be a little worried if we start putting too many numbers on here and then scoring. It's going to become, I don't know. You know, this is not a purely empirical exercise. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I'm going to take some public comment.
Can I just say that I completely agree with everything Greg just said? Plus one to that.
Great.
All right.
You can always say that. Yes, thanks.
I'm going to stop sharing the presentation since we're moving to public comment. Thank you for everybody for your feedback so far.
Thanks, Carrie. And I don't think I said it very clearly, but you know, super kudos to you. This was amazing and quite the effort. And you turned it around faster than I think I've seen anyone turn anything around. So we really appreciate the help here. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jose so we can do public comment. I see 2 hands raised. So you can each have, oh, now I see 3. You can each have 2 minutes and go ahead.
All right, we have about 5 hands up. The first is Jason Stinson, followed by Youngjin O. So let me allow you to talk, and please unmute yourself.
All right, good. Excellent. Hey, just real quick, I wanted to go back to the AECOM matrix. I think you guys already talked to this a little bit, but definitely on the Churchill evaluation, I think the rows A and B, which are facilitate movement across the corridor and reduce delay congestion for vehicle traffic, I tend to agree with some of the comments that XCAP members have already made that doesn't necessarily reflect the actual movement through what I would call the corridor. I understand why AECOM treats the word corridor in that row as meaning the intersection. I certainly would feel better if they said facilitate movement across the intersection for all modes of transportation. To me, it feels like when I read that and it says corridor, it's saying that there, you know, especially the closure plus mitigations, that it doesn't really treat it correctly. It's true that at that intersection, we are limiting movement, but it doesn't mean that we are blowing it up. So it ends up looking really strange. So I think figuring something out there, I know you guys don't have a lot of control over what staff does. And I realize staff, of course, dropped off before they could get any public comments, which is convenient, but it would be, it'd be great to at least give them that feedback. Now, I also agree with the other comment about the funding sources. It's quite strange that staff would have rated row E as really bad for the closure when it's the cheapest option. That's actually really strange. I don't know what was going on there or how that was missed. They use just a lot of rows, but it's unusual. On Carrie's stuff, just quick public comment on that. It's amazing. I think it's also echoing XCAP stuff. It's really, really impressive. I will say the one challenge is as it's presented now, and I realize it's just showing a process by doing, it's not the actual results, but there's definitely a lot of things in there that I think we're making a lot of the public go crazy, particularly on the funding for Churchill, and a lot of those same things got reflected over probably incorrectly. So it's driving a lot of us kind of nuts. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Young Jae Oh. followed by Drew. Just a second here. All right. May you unmute yourself?
Yes, once again, I would like to thank you all for your incredible effort and dedication for this matter. My family and I live in Southgate area, and we strongly favor the closure of Churchill with mitigation at Embarcadero and Oregon Expressway and a bike path underpass. We support the closure because of cost, safety, traffic friendliness, and the preservation of the character of our charming neighborhood. At the same time, we would like to stress that we prefer that Churchill stays open, but not at the price of setting up a concrete monstrosity in the middle of our neighborhood. We strongly also oppose the two other proposals, which is the partial underpass and the viaduct. If you look at the hexagon report, figures 2 and 3B, it will become painfully clear that either will be an eyesore for the neighborhood. Regarding the proposed XCAP generated matrix, we ask that the criteria description on page 2, lines H.01 and H.02 be changed to need or want instead of a hard constraint that must be met. If these were really hard constraints, they would rule out Churchill closure in the first place. Clearly, that was not the intent of the City Council when they set up these criteria and charged the XCAP with evaluating Churchill closure as one of the viable options for this intersection. Finally, in response to the concerns of some Southgate residents that Churchill closure would leave them cut off from the rest of the city, we suggest that even with Churchill closure, this could be amply mitigated by opening up some of the streets in Southgate and adjacent areas that are currently blocked off. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Next, we have Drew, followed by Richard Perkey. There you go. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, on the second part here, the Carey's matrix. So on the personas, I think it may just be a slash on this that I'm going to bring up, but not a separate line. But I do think there needs to be something around ADA. It's just not pedestrians. It's just not cyclists. There's also how someone approaches this with an ADA constraint. Ramps, there's a whole set of constraints that are around that. So you may be able to say pedestrian / ADA or something like that. But I do think it's ultimately a pretty critical formula for funding in a variety of buckets. And then just the other one is more where things may be headed as far as it's just not bicycles, it's also scooters. But I don't know in Palo Alto how much you see scooters. I see them around where I'm living, just random stuff. It's not all bicycles anymore. It's unicycles and just a lot of stuff. So that one's more just and then the one that did areas in Palo Alto based on different public comments and different things I've heard, it's like, if it's just live near the tracks versus the rest of Palo Alto, like there's strong opinions on which side of the tracks, and like Embarcadero and Churchill closing, that puts a bunch of traffic on the neighborhood streets that they don't have that traffic now. And so there may need to be some separation, like you need two different rows to deal with this contention between, some of the alternatives. I think Churchill's probably got the most of that versus some of the other ones. So thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Richard Perkey, followed by Elizabeth Alexis. You may unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, thanks. So I have just a couple of comments on the AECOM summary of evaluation. Again, at the Churchill crossing in row A, I think actually this whole row A in comparison of the three alternatives has been much improved. This is in terms of the text, but I have an issue with the assessment of the impacts. And I think this was raised by Dave Shen earlier. while closure doesn't facilitate movement across the corridor, the mitigation measures that are included in the proposal do. So the hexagon traffic study of the Churchill closure, that's in Appendix A, shows that if Churchill is closed with the mitigations, the traffic diverted can be handled on Oregon Expressway and Embarcadero with improvements at all of those intersections. So how this outcome kind of gets portrayed across the three alternatives as negatively portrayed with a moderate impact instead of some degree of improvement, or unless neutral impact surprises me, especially given that the same number of turns and throughput is changed in the partial underpass as in the closure with mitigations. Also in row E, in the finance was also mentioned and picked up by a few earlier comments. If this is a relative comparison of the cost impact, I think in terms that then the partial underpass at about 3 times the cost of the closure should be increased to moderate impact, and then the viaduct increased to the most impact to give that relative cost comparison that's picked up in and shown in the text down below. I'm also a little baffled at row H. Oh, sorry, over top. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Alexis, followed by Rob Levetsky. I unmuted you. You may begin. You can unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Alexis. I just have 2 quick comments. First, on the AECOM matrix, this on the noise column for the partial underpass at Charleston. And I guess this comment would also apply to Churchill. Right now, it's not possible to put up even a low noise barrier for wheel noise, or even a higher one, which would do a double purpose as keeping people off the right of way. But I think it's important to add those in the noise discussion, that those are potential options, which could even further reduce the noise if we wanted to. Then I want to talk for just a minute about Carrie's matrix, which I just think is a really helpful kind of, especially as far as process. I like the idea of these personas. I think it would be good on some of these to sort of add the direct connection or link to the city staff member or agency or board who might be in charge, kind of own all those criteria or own those, own whether it's a constraint, a need, or a want. So for instance, on the bicycle, we might be both the school traffic safety committee and payback, and that they could be involved in looking at those criteria, both defining them and then doing the evaluation. But yeah, I think that's just really helpful. I think it takes these sort of generic categories, which are, I know we need to have a 1-page or whatever, but I think there's a lot of important detail that gets missed. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Rob Levetsky. I'm going to unmute you or allow you to talk, and please unmute.
Hello, this is Rob Levitsky. The point of this whole exercise was to increase connectivity across Palo Alto, and I can't see how closing Churchill would contribute to that. Mr. Hexagon, Gary Black, has noted that there's 9,500 cars a day that cross the tracks there at Churchill. And it's absurd to think that you could dump them between Oregon and Embarcadero and add a bunch of signals to slow down Embarcadero and think that you're going to mitigate the problem and make it better at all the situations. It is absolutely absurd. It's also ridiculous to take and import the problem from Churchill and dump it onto Embarcadero and just say, oh, let's put in a couple of signals here and stop the traffic even more. We've already got 3 signals within about 100 yards on Embarcadero, and you'd just be adding a 4th one on Embarcadero. That's really going to help traffic get around. So I'm patently opposed to closing Churchill, not to mention the whole Caltrain thing is going to be way in abeyance for the next couple of years. So it's been nice studying this with you guys, but it doesn't make any sense to put anything in stone right now. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have another speaker, Suzanne Newman. I will let you speak. And please unmute yourself.
Hi there, thanks. I think I'll start with a little comment on the hexagon report. And I just want to say that a number of the questions and public comments about the traffic effects of the different alternatives raise the issue for me again of basing the findings or conclusions entirely on LOS, projected LOS at a few stoplights, rather than a richer picture of the traffic network. Now, I don't know how you would do that. So I'm not a traffic engineer, and I understand that this is a nice, clean way to model something. But I think there are so many where we're sort of pointing at a bunch of unforeseen or unanalyzed consequences for neighborhood streets nearby, intersections when they change, but we have no way of kind of estimating what that might be. And then I just have to add one more thing, which is maybe I have missed something, but my understanding from reading the hexagon report is that while Embarcadero will be maybe substantially improved LOS as you go up and down that road, or somewhat improved, that the intersection at El Camino in Oregon, Page Mill, will not be. It's going to be pretty bad if a bunch of additional traffic gets diverted in that direction. So, and then I had a little nitpick that leads to a question. Matrix. Just to say the language that compares the three alternatives on row E, the language is incommensurable, and I would like to know what's meant by substantial local resources and what's meant by the possibility of having federal, state, regional funding for some of the alternatives and not at all apparently for the viaduct. And I'm kind of curious about that I know that's know exactly what's going to happen there, but it seemed that somebody should take a look at that, kind of clean that language up. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you. That concludes our public speakers.
Great, thank you. So I did want to bring it back to Millette and her team. Could you respond a little bit to the questions about the finance with feasible funding sources? I too have a question about the Churchill one, for example. I couldn't figure out why, if they were relative to each other, why wasn't it a 1, 2, 3 basically of orange, or could you speak to that?
Yeah, this is Millette. I think in looking back at it, I think what we did on the finance as far as on Churchill with the orange one being, wait, hang on, let me get it in front of me again so I can see it. And we're talking about the finance one, correct? So we had them rated at the same level, like the, that is what I made the mistake of what we said we wouldn't do was I went back, I was comparing it when we did this, looking at the dollar ranges that were from Meadow Charleston. So so we ranked the partial underpass similar to what we did of a hybrid, which was the one, was a 1 orange. So I think in looking, I agree with the comments after looking at this further, and we would likely propose for row E here that we would put 1 orange square for the closure, 2 for the partial underpass, and likely 3 for the viaduct is how we would do that, redo that one.
Okay, thank you. And question about the noise element. So yeah, in the noise report, it basically said that even with that grade alternatives, if you put in a sound barrier, then you could actually have significant noise improvement. Is there a way to reflect that? I realize that what you've done is sort of reflect what the actual alternative is versus like sort of what the options would be.
Correct. I think likely I'll have to talk to Paul, but I think we could probably add that sentence about a parapet wall that we have in the other ones, like under that it would help reduce the noise. I think that's what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, something that just basically, and then to what extent? So if you put a sentence and said, okay, we added a parapet, does it change it, you know, for the underpass, for example, does it change it from 1 blue box to 2 blue box? And I think that's relative to what the noise report had, because it drops the numbers pretty significantly versus the, you know, versus the other alternatives, right? So.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I looked at that, you know, in the when we rated the noise ones, it was based on, you know, the summary paragraph that's in that report. And basically, you know, from, yes, I mean, I think the overall point was that, yes, there's variations in the numbers, but from a noise perspective, it's not like huge differentiators of, you know, one being super loud and one being so much better. So that's, you know, based on Paul's input and recommendation, that's how we rated them very equally, with the exception of the tunnel at grade, because, and sadly, that's because it's reducing the traffic lane. So it's, you know, we didn't add that verbiage to the comment or to the text there.
Yeah, thank you. I see that it's like for the, even for the noise and vibration for Churchill, there's improvement relative to just today, right? With adding a noise parapet, which I think is hard to capture since these color codings are to compare the alternatives to each other and not to sort of existing as well. So that makes it harder. Okay, that's helpful. Is there any other ex-capper who had any other suggestions or comments based on public comment?
I might just add one more if I could. There was comment about the federal funding language also in the finance one.
Yeah.
And I think that was also just representative of the, you know, the more costly the alternative is, the more likely that it couldn't be funded by local or state resources, whether that's a business tax or whatever that is, and that you would have to get federal support and you know, funding in order to fund that. So that's where that language is. It's related to the overall magnitude of cost, not that you couldn't get possibly some federal funding for a lower cost alternative, but it's less likely. So.
Okay. It might be helpful to include, because I recognize that the council criteria is ambiguous. And so this is your team doing a heroic job of trying to sort of figure out how to best represent that. And so maybe we can add a line at the bottom that just basically says exactly that it's a percentage of the order of magnitude, and that's sort of generally how it's intended to be representative, not that you can't get a small number of federal dollars for small projects. And that would be.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's, you know, less likely that the federal government's going to fund a smaller project, right? I mean, there's not always, but yeah, that's generally the perception, that it needs a larger, something that's in the billions of dollars needs federal support. So
yeah, given how important the funding conversation has now become, I think whatever we can do to sort of explain that to the average person who sees this chart would be, it'd be nice to have an extra descriptor somewhere, or descriptive thing somewhere. Carrie, I see your hand up.
Yes, I just think that all the feedback from the public comment was very welcome. I took some notes. There's some immediate things we could incorporate, and there are some others that may take discussion with the XCAP, but being able to be more inclusive in our language around pedestrians and bike riders is easy to incorporate. It's already done, so done it. Also, the suggestion about you know, referring to who is the deciding making body or recommending body for given areas, and do we want their input? I think that's a great topic of discussion for the XCAP. I think, of course, we would like to encourage their input, so it might be a nice way to do that. And then one other thing that you and I had spoken about, but we haven't brought up yet, was on the Meadow Charleston alternatives. Do we need to split that out? So I don't know if we want to have that discussion tonight or another time.
Yeah, I mean, because it's dynamic, I think we could even do that as part of the deliberations. But I guess if ex-cappers have a general opinion, then it'd be nice to be able to do it in advance. So what Carrie's referring to is that currently in the city's matrix, all the boxes are evaluated as just underpass. And there is a difference between the design of Meadow versus the design of Charleston, where there's certain, for example, Meadow has 6 of the 8 turn movements, while Charleston has all 8. And so question about whether, Carrie designed this to match exactly the format, at least generally, of the city's one, and wanted to know whether you guys felt it would make sense to break out the Charleston and Meadow underpasses into 2 separate columns, one for Meadow and one for Charleston, where we could then get more granular on what that is. And that might actually really help if our conversation ends up going to, do we want a underpass at one and a hybrid at another, for example? Because I've heard a little bit of discussion about that, and I don't know if that's where we end up, but it might help facilitate that conversation. So my general suggestion would be yes, if there's ex-cappers who say absolutely or are vehemently opposed, it would be great to know that. Otherwise, I think it would be really helpful for our discussions. Anybody want to chime in? We'll just do this popcorn style. Just go ahead and speak.
I'm hesitant to make that matrix larger, but I keep thinking about the possibility of having a partial underpass on one and a hybrid on the other, and that it might solve some problems. So.
I'm talking about Carrie's matrix. I don't mean
I know.
Matrix. Okay, just to be clear.
No, I mean, even Carrie's matrix is already fairly large.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, we'd be talking about potentially adding 4 columns, right? So there's partial, hybrid, partial. I guess that's 3.
We can hide columns on Carrie's, which is nice, right? Because
okay, yeah.
We've already sort of, as a group, thought about not discussing the South Palo Alto tunnels. So that already eliminates 2 columns. So we can just scooch those over and then, right? Yeah. So.
I would also add, I had the same concerns as Greg. I would add that if we wanted to split out Meadow and Charleston into separate tabs, we could still only evaluate the ones that have to go together once and then just copy that information over if you needed to evaluate them independently. So throwing that out there as an option. What really is the goal of this is to help us deliberate. It's a tool for us to see the choices in front of us better. So it's really all it is. What way is the most useful for us to look at it? We might not know yet, but wanted to plant that seed.
Yeah, I see. Phil, go ahead.
Okay, so very briefly, a lot of what I was going to say, Carrie just said, this is a tool. The objective of XHAP is not to produce a matrix, it's to produce decisions. And the matrix is there to aid us. And yes, that may mean more complexity because the decisions are necessarily complex. I wouldn't want to try to simplify away the alternatives from among the ones that are on the table, specifically meaning hybrid, underpass, and a hybrid and an underpass between Meadow and Charleston.
Thank you, Phil. Anybody else?
I'll go.
Sure.
As much as I hate to see more columns in Excel, whatever sheets, I think we probably should split it out. I mean, they have different characteristics, and we'll do one justice if we didn't kind of talk about it separately, especially if the options are different. So yeah, I would say, unfortunately, advocate for more, separating Meadow and Charleston.
Okay, great. Anybody opposed to that? It sounds like everyone generally agrees and would like to sort of see how it looks like, but if anybody's opposed, Tony, I see your hand up.
Different subject.
Oh, okay. Let's just stay on this for a second, and then unless anybody is vehemently opposed, Carrie, go for it, and then we can see. That'll help us with our conversation.
All right. I can mock it up and we can make a decision at future meeting.
Great. Tony?
Yes. Mute me. Sorry about this. I'm not sure if this is the right time to talk about this, but since everyone else is discussing, under A, for instance, it says facilitate movement across the corridor for all modes. Should we, Carrie, have 3 modes then? Pedestrians, bikes, and cars? in your pull down menu, should we have 3 then, or?
I like that a lot. And I also heard Dave and some other folks that are in that neighborhood suggest some additional constraints or rewording on those constraints. Would it be all right if, like, I incorporate that feedback from Tony right now and then possibly work offline with Dave to come up with some proposals for the next time?
I mean, if it's okay with the group, I'd like to give Carrie the ability to sort of update this based specifically on the feedback that she heard today, but also obviously the AECOM updated their matrix right when Carrie did. So that's not in there either. And again, this is all just because it'll be part of a discussion. And what I'm envisioning, and Larry, you and I will have to chat offline, but kind of what I'm imagining is that when we start our deliberations for Churchill, for example, we would have this on the screen. And as we kind of talk through things, we could say, okay, this is how I'm feeling about these different things. And it'll just serve as a basis for conversation. You know, so again, nothing that she's putting in here means that this is what we've all agreed to. It's just something to facilitate conversation for later. And if that's okay with everybody, you know, we don't have to take any formal action necessarily on giving Carrie guidance for this because it's a working tool that will come back. It's not a document. Is everybody okay with that? If you're not, feel free to raise your hand. I see a thumbs up. Okay, and I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to take that as a yes. So Carrie, we appreciate all the extra work this is going to cause for you, but we're excited. And yeah, I think that I would say that in terms of the lives near the tracks or all Palo Alto residents, I was thinking that one thing that you might add is near an impacted area. So I'm thinking specifically in the closure, you have an impacted area that's not immediately adjacent to the tracks. And so
that's great. I like that.
Yeah, so that would help.
The partial underpass too impacts people who don't live near the tracks.
So would we also keep live near the tracks and add lives near an impacted area? Would they be?
And again, this is just for points of discussion for later, right? But I think those are 3 pretty representative groups. We might come up with more as we talk.
That's great. Okay.
But and then I loved the pedestrian ADA suggestion, and then the bike riders, scooters, you know, people moving on wheels that are not vehicles. That's basically what that category is.
Right.
So,
I had trouble with the ADA requirement or suggestion because it's a requirement.
Yes.
Larry, that's exactly why I didn't include it, but it's always good to be explicit that.
Well, I worry about mission creep.
Yeah, me too, Larry. I don't think it's required because it is required. We don't have to put that in.
What if we put it in the note column? Then we have it, you know, annotated there that this would include anybody that's looking for the ADA requirements. It's included in our laws. I mean,
well, but I think that the distinction is that there are things that legally meet ADA requirements, but are not necessarily, like, you can have a maximum 8% grade, but 5% is really preferred. And Philip, maybe you can chime in on this a little bit, but I think there's sort of this is what's legally required, but this is what we really would, so it comes down to want versus a constraint. So the constraint is it has to meet ADA compliance. The want is to make it super ADA friendly. You might change the grade of a bike path or something. I think that's what
I'm troubled by that too, Nadia.
Okay.
One of our factors is cost, and I'm very sensitive to the ADA requirement. And I think I would like to hear Tony say what's his experience as to how the ADA requirements are folded into a project.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So the ADA is the maximum slope or the maximum criteria that you can go to. We try not to get to that maximum because it's for instance, in a pedestrian sidewalk, it's excessive in my experience. And I think in several other people who have complained about steep slopes to an architect. Now, it's not like you cannot go to it legally, but just like Caltrain doesn't want to go to a 2% slope, from a comfort point of view, they prefer 1%. It's the same way with the ADA. Having an 8% slope is allowed, but 4% or 5% is much, much more comfortable. So it's that kind of thing that Nadia wants to flag, but I don't know where we do it.
I see Philip voice.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have much to add to this, but yeah, we would have to design everything within ADA rules. So we wouldn't have an option to have a slope or something that's designed without proper curb cuts or whatever. It's a series of things that are necessary for ADA design. So we wouldn't be able to exceed that. That doesn't mean that we would necessarily design everything to be on the outer limits of that. Like Tony said, I mean, just because something's acceptable within that criteria doesn't mean it necessarily feels great.
Well, it could be something that as we deliberate, we can figure out whether there's anything that needs, because from a high level, we're talking about the grade separation itself, right? Do you want a trench or a tunnel or a viaduct? And ADA things don't really come into that. I think the only time it really comes into play is going to be more for the details around some of the bike ped stuff, which we all know at this stage is very cursory. And we can give suggestions that, hey, we got a lot of feedback on this or that, but it doesn't ultimately drive the decision of, are we choosing a viaduct over a trench over a tunnel? Because the consultants have always told us that they can tweak the bike ped things to be able to meet those requirements. So is the group okay with that?
That's right. And I would say also that that is really something that can be more further developed at a later state.
Yeah.
So I would add that one of the benefits of grouping these personas together is to ensure that we have invited feedback and participation from these different groups and that people aren't left out. So I appreciate the public comment about the ADA aspect. And I hope that if we can include it in the notes or in the label or whatever we decide to do, that it results in us at least having a chance to engage with members of that community. So when we make our decision, they
One
feel
other thing I
included.
want to emphasize is that this is the ADA stuff not at this level. It's at a much further point down the road when we get into discussions as to what level of ADA enhancements are going to be necessary. So I think we really confuse people by including.
Okay. So again, it's a tool for us. So, when it comes up in discussion, if we feel we need it, we can put it in. It sounds like for now, it doesn't seem like it should be a breakout column for now. So that's okay. Okay, do we have anything else on this item or, and Philip, do we have to take any action for the AECOM matrix or we've already just given direction? Is that enough?
I think we have enough.
Okay.
Sorry, Ripon, do you feel comfortable? Let Peter, anyone else?
Yeah, I guess
Nobody else.
have the direction from the XCAP committee on few elements that Millet has already discussed that could be, addressed and made it as a final submission.
Okay, great.
I have a question, Nadia.
Mm-hmm.
Does our count of who I can work with reset now that we've presented?
Yes, it does.
Okay. If people who haven't already had a chance to give input on this or work with me on this want to reach out, I think I can talk to up to 3 people.
Yes, and I will opt out of this one since I've already seen it the first time, so that anybody else who wants to work with Carrie has a chance to do that.
Okay, so I'll have to remove your access temporarily until we represent it again.
Sure, that's
okay. But so Dave, is there anyone else that wants to volunteer to give input?
We got Tony and Dave, I saw.
Okay, great. I'll work with you guys over the interim. Thank you.
Great. You might want to check with Keith, who's not here. He must have got caught at the lab. So
yeah, good idea. I'll do that.
Yes, and if Keith wants to be on it, I can come off.
Yeah, and similarly, I already had my chance, so I think someone else can do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think with that we can move to item number 5. So it's just an update on the working groups and kind of a check-in on the report. So I drafted a memo that sort of updates everyone on, because of the Brown Act, we have this problem of how many documents I've touched and who gets to go where. So we had to, as an informational attachment, you have the draft of the XCAP findings, chapter 4, which is basically the stuff that Megan worked on before she left. We made that public so that then now, because too many of us had seen it, so now Larry can actually look at it and I can finally discuss it with him because we couldn't do that otherwise. So we're working within the boundaries that we have. And then on my memo to the group, you should have in there which is your section and then who you're supposed to send your section to. So if there's any questions, that let me know. Tony, I see your hand up. Did you have a question about that part? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, sorry. Just wanted to understand the Brown Act issues, and Philip might be able to help me. When if I'm out and Kerry takes on a new person, is that a serial meeting?
Sorry, you've all caught me as I'm trying to grab a snack here. Both times. Sorry, to answer your question, no, because the materials have been presented to the public at that state, and it's so any development beyond this is a new item, essentially.
Okay, so is everyone clear who's on this call of when you've written your section, who it goes to? And is there any questions on that? Okay, great. And then just to update the group, because Dave Shen had some good questions for me. So he had questions about, how are we making this look pretty and what's the style that we're using? And my answer back was, Larry and I haven't had a chance to talk about it yet. We're hoping to kind of maybe figure out some style sheets, I guess is the term, which will talk about the sort of the font and generally how that works. That is not a skill that I have, but if there's anyone in the group who has wordsmithing skills or I should say report making skills that we didn't know about, now would be the time to diverge your amazing skills and let us know, because maybe we can ask you questions about how to do this. Otherwise, you could hopefully be continuing to work on your sections. And I just did want to call out, we have a meeting next week, and then we have a break for the week of August 5th. That's partly to give everybody just a break because we've been working hard on this through this entire thing, but also because as you guys know, I'm moving. So I just found out that my move date got pushed. So I'm actually now moving on August 11th. So I will be here for the 12th. You may see boxes behind me. I may seem a little more frazzled, but I think we can make this schedule work. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that we're skipping the 5th. So, have some fun. Oh, I did see that Keith was just able to join us. Keith, I don't know if we're on item number 5 and we're talking about our different report things. And so if you had any questions about the section that you guys are working on, it's basically the one that was just made public, which is Megan's section that you and Tony and Phil can now take a peek at together.
Yeah, no questions, just a lot of work to do.
Okay, anybody have anything on this? Okay, we actually have 3 members of the public who want to talk on this item. We're towards the end of the meeting, so I'm going to ask that those people can limit their comments to 1 minute. You can always send us something by email, but I am trying to be sensitive to our time because we're going to be going into marathon meetings going forward, and I'm trying not to burn out the XCAP volunteers. So timer's being set up.
Nadia, can I say one thing? That we've been very loose about it, and that's fine. But I think given the hour, we really have to insist that the members of the public speak to this item and not on just general topics.
Thank you. Yes. So please, this should be only on the outline that I have passed out for XCappers in terms of what sections they are turning in. That's what you would be giving comment on, not on anything else. So if that changes whether you want to speak or not, you can please drop your hand because that would be helpful. Otherwise, you're just speaking to the memo, which is attachment 5A. All right. I still see 3 hands, so go for it. 1 minute.
We have 3 raised hands, and we have Damani. Are allowed to talk? Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
G Mahani, can you unmute yourself? It looks like they're not there or something's happening. We can move on to the next one, I guess.
Okay. So we're gonna, Eduardo Latch is next. We're allowed to talk. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I am actually going to be talking to the Matrix because I somehow missed when you guys had the Matrix comments. I've been listening to this conversation for a number of hours now. I think all I want to say is that I did the math in terms of the blue dots and the orange dots, and it looks like in the case of Churchill closure, I'm pro the mitigation measures and the Churchill closure, you end up with essentially 1 or 2 dots, meaning you take the blue dots and subtract the orange dots, and you get basically all 3 options are either 1 or 2. Yet the price differences are massive, right? I mean, the viaduct is 6 times more expensive. The underpass is 3 times more expensive than mitigations and closure. So I think that matrix ought to bring that out. And I know that there is a row that talks about that, but it feels like the bottom row ought to be brought up with maybe 3 orange dots or 3 blue dots or some way then where you can get across the fact that there is a significant objective number that is different. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Hadidi.
Dear XCAP members, regarding the draft of XCAP findings chapter 4, we request the following change, namely to make clear in section B on traffic congestion, page 9, that a level of service at all the 7 intersections that would be impacted by Churchill closure is currently F or E, and that in the year 2030 with mitigations, the level of service on 5 of these 7 intersections would improve to A, B, or C. On the remaining 2 intersections, the level of service will slightly degrade by at most half a minute from the current minute or so. Embarcadero will remain at its current level of service of E, and Page Mill will degrade from E to F. See the Hexagon Report Appendix A, Table 6 versus Table 4. The bottom line is that overall traffic in Palo Alto will improve with only minor degradations at a couple of intersections. And please keep in mind that we are talking about the year 2030 with very frequent train trips. One important point to stress that has also been expressed by others is that Palo Alto currently has more railroad crossings than other cities in the Bay Area, even if we make adjustments for population. With the closure of Churchill, we would still have the most railroad crossings per capita. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And that concludes our public speakers.
Okay. All right. I think with that, we can move on to item 6, which is the staff update. And we have a couple of things. Sarah, did you want to explain what's happening next week with our Zoom invites?
Yes, sure. So I am going on vacation 4 days next week. I will be here on Monday, the 27th. So for your meeting on the 29th, I'm going to send stuff out on the 27th. You know, usually I send everything out on the morning of the meeting, but so I will send you your Zoom panelist invites on Monday, the 27th for the 29th. And I will bundle up all the written comments that come in, and I'll send those on the 27th instead of the 29th.
Great, thank you. And did we have any other staff updates, Ripon or Philip? Did you have anything else that we need to know?
No, I think everything is status quo. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And sorry, do we have, do you want to give them a preview of what's on the agenda for next week? I'm missing my handy sheet that I usually have here. I apologize.
We were planning to update. Hopefully, I will check back with AECOM and see what can be feasible within the next week or so to update layout, renderings, and patches, and possibly matrix, and bring it back to you in the following meeting. Okay, perfect. All right, and that would mean that we would start our deliberations at the meeting of August 12th, and we're going to start with deliberating on Churchill. So that's the meeting for you Churchill folks who are interested. That's the meeting.
Okay, I think with that, we are done. Thank you so much to everybody and to the Office of Transportation staff for making this go so smoothly, and to all of our attendees. And thank you, XCappers, and Carrie especially for all your work on that one. So we appreciate it. Thanks
Thank
all. Bye.
Bye now.